At its height, in the decades around 480 BC, the Persian Empire governed 44% of every human being alive on Earth. Not land, not territory. People, farmers and priests and weavers and soldiers, nearly 1 in every 2 souls drawing breath anywhere on the planet, from the shores of Libya to the edge of India, answering, in some form, to a single throne. No empire before it had come close, no empire after it ever would. That record still stands. They were not Persian, the vast majority of them. They were Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, Greek, Lydian, Armenian, Indian. Dozens of peoples, speaking dozens of languages, praying to dozens of gods. And most of them went on doing exactly that. Their temples stayed open. Their customs stayed intact. Their local rulers, in many cases, kept their seats. What held it all together was not terror, and it was not a single sword. It was something far harder to build and far harder to explain. How one people governed half of humanity, and why that story has remained for most of us almost entirely untold, is where we are going. The land between the 2 rivers was old before anyone thought to name it. The Tigris and the Euphrates ran south from the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of Armenia, carrying snowmelt and silt down into the flat plain of what is now southern Iraq, and where they slowed and spread, the ground was extraordinarily fertile. Grain grew there in quantities that astonished people who came from drier lands. The rivers flooded in spring, retreated in summer, and left behind a dark soil ready to be planted. It was not comfortable country, the heat was punishing, so the floods unpredictable, the marshes breeding grounds for insects and disease. But it fed people, and people who are fed stay, and people who stay build. By around 3,500 BC, settlements along the lower Euphrates had grown into something the world had never seen before. Cities. Not large villages, not ceremonial gathering points, but true urban centers with thousands of inhabitants, full-time craftsmen, administrative hierarchies, and monumental architecture rising from the flat plain. Uruk, the greatest of them, held somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people at its height, a number that would have been nearly incomprehensible to any human being alive 10 generations earlier. Other cities followed: Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, each one a walled world unto itself, each one governed by a king who ruled in the name of the city's god. The Sumerians, the people who built these cities, had no iron, almost no timber, and no stone worth speaking of. What they had was mud. The entire built world of early Mesopotamia rose from river clay, shaped into bricks and fired in kilns or dried in the sun. Temples, palaces, city walls, drainage channels, the great step towers called ziggurats. All of it was mud brick, and all of it required constant maintenance as the material crumbled and was rebuilt generation after generation. The ziggurats stood at the physical and spiritual center of each city, their flat tops reserved for the gods, their lower platforms for priests and administrators. A Sumerian farmer walking toward his city from the fields could see the ziggurat long before he saw anything else. It was the first thing that told him where home was. Writing appeared in this world around 3,400 BC, not as literature or poetry, but as accounting. The earliest surviving texts are inventories, lists of grain deliveries, livestock counts, ration allocations. The priests who managed the temple economies needed to track what came in and what went out across hundreds of transactions involving thousands of people, and human memory was not adequate to the task. So they pressed marks into wet clay tablets, dried them, and stored them. The system developed over centuries from simple pictographs into the wedge-shaped script known as cuneiform, capable of recording not just numbers, but language itself. Within 1,000 years of its invention, people were using it to write laws, hymns, epics, and letters. It was one of the most consequential inventions in human history, and it was born from the need to count barley. These Sumerian city-states were never a unified empire. They competed with one another, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, shifting dominance from city to city across centuries. Then, around 2334 BC, a man named Sargon of Akkad changed the rules. He was probably a palace official who seized power in the city of Kish, and within a generation he had conquered most of Mesopotamia and created something new. A single state administered from a single center, answering to a single king. The Akkadian Empire was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. It lasted roughly a century and a half before collapsing under a combination of internal revolt and what appears to have been a prolonged drought severe enough to devastate the agricultural base on which everything depended. What Sargon had shown, though, could not be unshown. After the Akkadian Empire fell, Mesopotamia returned to its pattern of competing city-states, but the idea of unified imperial rule had taken hold. The third dynasty of Ur attempted something similar around 2100 BC and held the region together for a century before it, too, collapsed. Babylonia rose and fell. The Hittites swept down from Anatolia and sacked Babylon around 1595 BC. The Kassites ruled for 4 centuries. Power moved and changed hands and moved again, but through all of it, the cities endured, the canals were maintained, the grain was harvested, and the clay tablets kept accumulating in their thousands. Then, from around 900 BC, something different took shape in the north. The Assyrians had been a regional power for centuries, and based around the city of Ashur on the upper Tigris, but under a series of exceptionally aggressive kings, they began to expand in a way that no Mesopotamian state had managed before. Ashur-Nisirpal II, who came to the throne in 883 BC, launched campaigns in every direction and made no effort to conceal what happened to those who resisted. His own inscriptions describe the mutilation of prisoners, the burning of cities, the impalement of captives on stakes outside the walls of conquered towns. This was deliberate policy. Terror, as a strategic instrument, communicated loudly enough that the next kingdom along might choose submission over resistance. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that reached its peak in the 8th and 7th centuries BC was the most powerful state the ancient Near East had ever produced. It stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of the Iranian Plateau. Its armies moved along maintained road networks, supplied by a logistical system of remarkable sophistication. When cities were conquered, their populations were not always slaughtered. They were often deported instead, tens of thousands of people uprooted and resettled in distant provinces, their old communities dissolved, their identities broken apart. Over 2.5 centuries, an estimated 4 million people were relocated across the empire. The Assyrians did not want empty land. They wanted controllable labor and the systematic erasure of the loyalties that made peoples dangerous. But the very brutality that made Assyria feared also made it brittle. In every province that had been terrorized into submission was a province waiting for the moment to revolt. When the Babylonians under Nabopolassar allied with the Medes from the Iranian Plateau in 612 BC, they destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh so completely that within a generation, people had almost forgotten where it stood. The greatest empire the world had known to that point collapsed in less than a decade. What remained was a vacuum, a region of extraordinary wealth and productivity, cities full of administrators and priests and craftsmen, agricultural land capable of feeding millions, and no one yet capable of holding it all together. Into that vacuum, 2 powers now reached: the Neo-Babylonian Empire to the south and the Medes to the east. Neither of them would hold it for long. The world that Persia inherited was therefore not a blank landscape. It was one of the oldest and most densely civilized regions on earth, layered with competing traditions, rival priesthoods, ancient cities that had been sacked and rebuilt and sacked again across 2 millennia. Egypt to the west, had its own unbroken continuity stretching back beyond memory. The Greeks, along the Aegean coast, were building something entirely different from anything the Near East had produced. The Lydians of Anatolia sat on the crossroads of land routes between Europe and Asia. The peoples of the Iranian Plateau, including the Persians themselves, came from a world outside all of this, from the steppes and mountains to the east, and they had watched the civilizations of the river valleys for generations. Yet when the moment came for them to step into the center of that world, they would do something that Sargon and the Assyrian kings had never quite managed. They would make it want to be governed. To the east of the great river valleys, beyond the Zagros Mountains, stretched a world almost entirely unlike the one that Sumer and Babylon had built. The Iranian plateau was high, dry, and vast, a broad elevated tableland ringed by mountain ranges, with a burning salt desert at its center, and open grasslands and river valleys tucked between the ridges. It was not a land that rewarded the city builder in the same way that the Tigris and Euphrates rewarded those who settled their banks. Water was scarce, distances were long. The landscape demanded movement, and the peoples who lived across it organized their lives around animals: cattle, sheep, goats, and above all, horses. These were herders and horsemen first, farmers second, and they had been living across this plateau and the steppes beyond it for longer than anyone in Mesopotamia had thought to write their names down. Far to the northeast, somewhere in the grasslands north of the Caspian Sea and east of the Ural Mountains, lay the original homeland of a group of peoples who would, over the course of roughly 1,000 years, spread across an enormous portion of the known world. They were not a single tribe or a single kingdom. They were a loose family of related peoples who spoke variants of a common ancestral language, kept similar religious practices, and organized their societies around the clan, the tribe, and the herd. Around 2200 BC, some of these groups began moving south and east on a slow, generational drift, not an invasion but a migration, families and herds following pasture, generation after generation, down through Central Asia and onto the Iranian plateau. They brought horses, chariots, and a way of seeing the world with them. The Iranian plateau absorbed these newcomers over centuries. They did not displace the peoples already there, the Elamites in the southwest, the older highland communities in the Zagros valleys, so much as they settled among them, intermarried, traded horses, and gradually spread their languages across a landscape that had spoken entirely different tongues for millennia. It was not conquest in any organized sense. It was pressure, the slow, sustained pressure of mobile peoples with superior horses pressing into settled regions over generations. By around 1000 BC, now Iranian-speaking groups were established across a broad swath of the plateau, with the two most consequential of them settling in the valleys and mountains of the northwest and southwest, the Medes and the Persians. The Medes settled in the high country southwest of the Caspian Sea, in the region that would later be called Media, around the great fertile basin near what is now the city of Hamadan. The terrain suited them. The Zagros ranges that bounded their territory to the west were rich in the one commodity that made them valuable to every major power in the region: horses. Median horses were among the finest in the ancient world, strong, fast, and bred across generations for both speed and endurance. The Assyrians wanted them so badly they were willing to campaign repeatedly into the mountain passes of the Zagros just to extract tribute in horseflesh. For the Medes, the horse was not just a means of transport or a military asset. It was the center of their economy and the foundation of their reputation. The Persians settled further south and east in the region that the Elamites had long called Anshan, and that the Persians themselves called Parsa, the area known today as the province of Fars in southwestern Iran. Like the Medes, they were a pastoral people, organized into clans and tribes rather than cities and bureaucracies. They shared a language closely related to Median, shared many of the same religious beliefs, and almost certainly recognized in each other something of a common origin. But they occupied different terrain, and faced different neighbors, and those differences would eventually shape them into distinct peoples with distinct destinies. For most of the period before Cyrus, the Persians were simply the smaller, quieter, more southerly cousin of the Medes, well aware of their kinship and equally well aware of the power imbalance between them. Both peoples, when they first appear in the written record, are encountered not through their own words, but through the complaints of their neighbors. The Assyrians, ever meticulous record keepers, mentioned the Medes in their annals as early as 835 BC, specifically in the records of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, who campaigned into the Zagros highlands and encountered Median tribal leaders who gave tribute and then, predictably, revolted the following year. The pattern was consistent across generations. Assyrian armies marched east into the mountains, extracted horses and silver and grain, installed local leaders who pledged loyalty, and withdrew. Within a season or two, the pledges dissolved. The Median chiefs were not stupid. They understood that Assyrian power had limits, specifically the limit of its ability to project force across mountain terrain it could enter but never fully control. What the Assyrians encountered in the Zagros was not a unified enemy, but a landscape of competing tribal lords, each controlling a fortified settlement and the villages around it, each willing to cooperate with Assyrian demands when the armies were present and to ignore them when they were not. The Medes at this stage were not a people with a king or a capital. They were a collection of related tribes who shared a language, a religion, and a horse-breeding tradition, and who occasionally cooperated and occasionally fought each other with equal energy. The Persians further south were even less visible to the Assyrian record keepers, a smaller grouping in a more remote valley, vassals in the Median sphere, rarely significant enough to merit a separate mention. They were, to all outward appearances, a minor people on the outer edge of the civilized world, which is almost exactly what they remained until a single man changed everything. The landscape that shaped both peoples deserves its own moment. The Zagros Mountains run for roughly 1,600 kilometers from the highlands of eastern Turkey down to the Persian Gulf, a great spine of folded limestone and shale, rising in places above 4,000 meters, laced with river valleys and high intermontane plains where the rainfall was sufficient to sustain both agriculture and pasture. In spring, the high valleys bloomed. Streams ran cold from the snowpack above, irrigating fields of grain and pastures thick with grass. In summer, the herders moved their animals upward toward the alpine meadows, and in autumn, they moved them back down. The rhythm of the Zagros had not changed in any fundamental way for thousands of years. The Medes and Persians inherited it, lived inside it, and were shaped by it. The mountains gave them horses, gave them defensible ground, and gave them the habit of independence. There was one thing these Iranian peoples carried with them from the steppe that the city-building civilizations of the river valleys had never quite possessed in the same form: a relationship with the open sky that had shaped their religion from the beginning. Out on the grasslands, there was nowhere to hide from the elements. The sky was enormous, the wind constant, the sun and fire the central sources of warmth and light in a world that could be brutally cold. The Iranian peoples had developed over generations a set of religious beliefs oriented around the natural forces: fire, water, earth, and sky, and a deep sense that the world was divided between forces of truth and order on one side and forces of chaos and the lie on the other. These beliefs would eventually crystallize through the teachings of a prophet named Zarathustra on into a formal religious system. But even before that crystallization, they gave the Iranian peoples a distinct moral sensibility that would mark everything they built. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the world had arranged itself into a set of interlocking power relationships that left both the Medes and the Persians firmly in the subordinate position. Assyria dominated the west, Babylon controlled the southern plains, Elam held the lowlands immediately west of Parsa. The Iranian peoples were useful to all of these powers as horse suppliers, occasional mercenaries, and tribute payers, and threatening to none of them as long as they remained fragmented. That fragmentation was the essential condition of their powerlessness, and every major power in the region had a vested interest in maintaining it. The Assyrians in particular had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of preventing highland peoples from uniting. They understood, with the clarity that comes from long experience, that a unified Iranian plateau was a threat that could not be managed. They were right. They just could not prevent it forever. The Medes did not choose to unite. Unity was forced on them by a power that could not leave them alone. Through the 9th and 8th centuries BC, Assyrian armies crossed the Zagros passes with regularity, not to annex the highlands permanently, which their logistics could not sustain, but to extract horses, silver, and grain, and to punish any chief who had stopped paying tribute since the last visit. The raids were effective in the short term. They were also, over generations, catastrophically counterproductive. So every time an Assyrian army marched east and roughed up a collection of independent Median lords, it reminded those lords of the one thing they shared: a common enemy. Pressure, applied relentlessly and without resolution, is one of the oldest forges of political identity in human history. The Medes were shaped on that forge. A man named Darius is credited by Herodotus with first uniting the Median tribes into a single kingdom around the early 7th century BC. His exact historicity is uncertain. The details of his story have the shape of legend more than biography. But the unification itself was real, and it probably happened through a combination of military authority, shrewd political calculation, and the accumulated weight of common grievance. What is clear is that by the late 7th century, a king was ruling from a new capital called Ecbatana, set at roughly 1,800 meters in the foothills of Mount Alvand in the fertile basin of what is now the city of Hamadan. Herodotus described it as a city of 7 concentric walls, each one higher than the last, the innermost containing the palace and its treasuries. Whether or not that description was precise in every detail, the city that rose from the Hamadan plain was something genuinely new. A political center for a people who had previously had none. Ecbatana meant in the old Iranian tongue, the gathering place. The name was not incidental. The city existed primarily as a statement that the Medes had a king, a court, and a capital worthy of the world they were entering. The plain around it was productive. Streams fed by snowmelt from Alvand irrigated fields of barley and wheat. Yes, and the surrounding hills supported the horse pastures on which Median wealth had always rested. The city sat astride the great east-west corridor that connected Mesopotamia with the Iranian Plateau, and beyond that, the trade routes running towards Central Asia. Merchants moving lapis lazuli, tin, and textiles between the east and the great river cities of the west passed through or near it. The chiefs who controlled the road grew richer than the chiefs who did not, and the richer chiefs had better horses, better weapons, and better ability to absorb or coerce the smaller ones around them. Ecbatana was the product of geography as much as politics. The second Median king, Phraates, pushed further than his father. He extended Median authority over the Persian tribes to the south, and bringing the kindred people of Parsa into the Median orbit as a subordinate, a relationship that would hold uneasily for more than a century. He also turned his ambitions toward Assyria itself, which proved a different calculation entirely. An early campaign against the Assyrian heartland ended in defeat, Phraates himself almost certainly dying in the engagement. The Medes pulled back into their mountains. Assyria continued. But the attempt had been made, and it had demonstrated something important. The Medes were willing to think at the scale of empire, even when the execution fell short. Then, the Scythians came. From the steppes north of the Caucasus, these formidable horse nomads poured into the Near East in the late 7th century, pushing through the Caucasian passes and raiding as far as the Levant and Egypt. For a period that lasted somewhere between a decade and a generation, the Medes fell under Scythian domination, a subordination that was probably less a formal conquest than a relationship of tribute and military alliance imposed from a position of overwhelming cavalry strength. The Scythians were among the finest mounted warriors the ancient world produced, and they moved faster than any settled force could contain. The Medes endured this period and studied it. Cyaxares, who came to the Median throne around 625 BC, ended it, according to Herodotus, by inviting the Scythian leaders to a feast and killing them while they were drunk. It is a story that may be embellished, but the political outcome is not disputed. Cyaxares reasserted Median independence, absorbed much of the remaining Scythian strength into his own forces, and turned his attention south and west. Cyaxares was the most significant ruler Media ever produced, and perhaps the most underappreciated military reformer in ancient history. He found a Median army organized along tribal lines, each clan fighting in its own way, with whatever weapons its men preferred, answering to its own chiefs. He restructured it from the ground up, dividing it into professional units of spearmen, archers, and cavalry, each equipped and trained to a standard set by the state rather than the household. It was, in concept, the kind of army the Assyrians had built, and Cyaxares had spent years watching the Assyrian model work. He understood that the way to beat a professional army was to build one. By the time he was ready to move against Assyria, the force he commanded was disciplined, coordinated, and organized for sustained campaign rather than seasonal raiding. Assyria, at the same time, was eating itself. The great king Ashurbanipal died around 627 BC, and the succession that followed was chaotic. Brothers fought over the throne, generals exploited the instability. The administrative machinery that had sustained the empire's vast military operations began to seize up. Provinces that had been held down by force sensed the loosening grip and began to test it. In the south, a Babylonian general named Nabopolassar had already declared independence and was fighting his way toward a fully independent Neo-Babylonian state. The empire that had terrorized the Near East for 3 centuries was fracturing from within, and the fractures were widening every year. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar saw the same opportunity and chose to take it together. The alliance they formed around 614 BC was cemented, as major political alliances in the ancient world almost always were, by marriage. Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, married Amytis, daughter of Cyaxares. 2 powers that had every reason to compete for the wreckage of Assyria instead agreed to divide it, the Babylonians taking Mesopotamia and the Levant, the Medes taking the northern territories and the Iranian Plateau. In 614 BC, the Median army struck first, marching on the ancient city of Ashur, the religious heart of Assyria, the oldest of its cities. They took it and sacked it completely, massacring its inhabitants and seizing its treasuries. When Nabopolassar arrived to find the ruins still smoking, he and Cyaxares met in the rubble and formalized their pact. 2 years later, the combined armies turned on Nineveh itself. Nineveh fell in the summer of 612 BC after a 3-month siege. The city that had stood as the greatest in the known world, a metropolis of 750 hectares, its walls lined with the sculpted records of Assyrian campaigns, its library holding tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets cataloging the accumulated knowledge of 2 millennia, was broken open, plundered, and left burning. The Assyrian king died in the siege, probably inside his own palace as it burned. A remnant of the army escaped westward and held out for another 3 years with Egyptian support, but the empire was finished. The end, when it came, was so complete that within a generation, as travelers crossing the Tigris plain could pass within sight of the mounds where Nineveh had stood and not know what the mounds were. A city that had once held the whole world's attention had become a forgotten shape in the earth. What the Medes did with their victory was revealing, and it foreshadows something important about the difference between them and what came next. They looted. They took silver and gold and portable wealth from every city they passed through. They absorbed territory, but they did not attempt to administer what they had taken in any systematic way. The Median Empire that emerged from the destruction of Assyria was more a zone of Median military dominance than a functioning state with bureaucracy, taxation, and law. Cyrus was a brilliant commander and a shrewd political operator, but he was working in the mode of the conqueror rather than the governor. The distinction matters enormously because it explains exactly what would make the next development so different. To the south, in the shadow of the Medes, the Persian king of Anshan was watching. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus inherited the throne of Anshan in 559 BC. It was a small kingdom in the valley country of Fars in southwestern Iran, dependent on the Medes, tribute-paying and obscure. He was almost certainly not the first of his line to sit on that throne. His father Cambyses I had ruled there before him, and his grandfather Cyrus I before that. But all of them had reigned as vassals, their authority resting ultimately on Median permission. The Plateau politics that surrounded him were clear. The Medes dominated, Babylon sat fat and powerful to the west. Lydia controlled the western end of Anatolia, and Egypt stood at the edge of the known world to the southwest. Cyrus, at the moment of his accession, commanded a minor hill kingdom of Iranian pastoralists and farmers, and had no obvious reason to be remembered by anyone outside his own valley. The stories that surrounded his birth and childhood were already legend by the time Greek writers set them down. Herodotus recorded a version in which his grandfather Astyages, the Median king, dreamed that a vine grew from the womb of his daughter Mandane and spread to cover all of Asia. Interpreters told him the dream meant her son would one day rule the world. Astyages ordered the infant killed. The general tasked with the deed could not bring himself to do it and handed the baby to a shepherd. Cyrus grew up in obscurity, his origins concealed, until at 10 years old, his natural authority over other children brought him to the attention of the very grandfather who had tried to have him destroyed. None of this is verifiable in any straightforward sense. What it tells us is not the facts of Cyrus's childhood, but the texture of what he became, a figure so consequential that the ancient world reached instinctively for the grammar of destiny to explain him. Whether or not Cyrus was literally the grandson of Astyages, he was probably related to the Median royal family by marriage, if not by blood, and the connection mattered politically. When he rose against Median rule around 553 BC, he was not simply a subordinate chief throwing off the yoke of a superior. He was presenting himself as a legitimate claimant to regional authority, someone who could absorb the Median world rather than merely defeat it. A key Median general named Harpagus, reportedly nursing grievances of his own against Astyages, defected to Cyrus with a substantial portion of the Median army. When the two sides met in full battle in 550 BC, the Median forces turned and joined the Persian side. Astyages was captured alive. His empire passed to Cyrus intact, with its court, its administration, and its prestige. What happened next defined everything that followed. Cyrus let Astyages live. He kept him at court. He treated the conquered Median nobility not as a subject population, but as a partner in the new arrangement, giving Medes high positions in his administration and his army. The Medes and Persians were closely related peoples, similar language, similar religion, similar customs, and Cyrus presented their union not as conquest, but as unification. In the eyes of the world watching from Babylon and Sardis and the Ionian coast, the transition of power from Astyages to Cyrus happened with a smoothness that was almost without precedent. No mass deportations, no executions of the former ruling class, no burning of the capital. The Persian Empire had begun, and it had begun without looking like an empire at all. The acquisition of Media brought Cyrus something he had not had before, a territorial conflict with Lydia. The Lydian king Croesus had been allied with Astyages, and with Astyages gone, the boundary between Lydian and former Median territory in western Anatolia was suddenly contested. Croesus, and famous across the Mediterranean world for the extraordinary wealth his kingdom commanded, the Lydians had invented coinage, and the gold of the river Pactolus ran through his treasury, decided that the moment of Median weakness was an opportunity. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, which told him that if he crossed the Hali River into Persian territory, a great empire would fall. He crossed the river. The empire that fell was his own. The campaign that followed moved at a pace that astonished everyone who observed it. After an inconclusive battle in Cappadocia, Croesus withdrew to Sardis for the winter, confident that no army would campaign across Anatolia in the cold season. Cyrus followed him anyway, covering the distance before Croesus could reassemble his allies. At the battle outside Sardis, Cyrus neutralized the Lydian cavalry, the finest in Anatolia, by placing camels at the front of his line. Horses would not go near camels and refused to advance. The Lydians were forced to dismount and fight on foot, at which point the tactical advantage evaporated. Sardis fell after a short siege. Lydia became a Persian province. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, which had paid tribute to Lydia, now paid it to Persia. In a single campaign, Cyrus had more than doubled the reach of his power. With Lydia absorbed and the Ionian coast secured, Cyrus turned east and northeast, spending the years between roughly 546 and 540 BC, bringing the eastern Iranian plateau under Persian authority, Parthia, Arya, Drangiana, Bactria, Sogdia, regions stretching from the edges of what is now Afghanistan toward the mountains of Central Asia. These campaigns moved along trade routes that had connected the Iranian world with the civilizations of the Indus Valley and the steppes for centuries. The peoples encountered along these routes were often Iranian-speaking themselves, distant cousins of the Persians and Medes, and Cyrus extended to them the same formula he had applied in the West. Submission was rewarded with preservation, local rulers kept their authority, and the machinery of daily life continued undisturbed. In 539 BC, Cyrus turned to Babylon. The city that had ruled Mesopotamia for centuries was in an unusual condition of internal weakness. Its king, Nabonidus, had spent years neglecting the cult of Marduk, the city's patron god and the theological cornerstone of Babylonian kingship, in favor of his own preferred deity, the moon god Sin. He had left Babylon for a decade to restore temples in northern Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to manage the city. The priests of Marduk were hostile to him. The urban population was restless. When Cyrus's forces defeated the Babylonian army at Opis on the Tigris in early October 539 BC, the city itself opened without a fight. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. At least, that is the story his administration told, and it was a story the Babylonians were prepared to believe. The clay cylinder that Cyrus had made and deposited in the foundations of Marduk's temple in Babylon within weeks of his arrival is the most direct surviving statement of how he governed. Written in Akkadian, the language of Babylon itself, it describes Nabonidus as an impious oppressor and presents Cyrus as the chosen agent of Marduk and is sent to restore proper order to the city. It records how Cyrus returned displaced peoples to their homelands, restored cult statues to their sanctuaries, and repaired ruined temples. The policies it describes were real. They were the same policies applied from one end of the empire to the other. But the cylinder's genius was rhetorical as much as administrative. It addressed the Babylonians in their own theological language, framed Persian conquest as divine restoration, and asked the people of the greatest city in the world to understand themselves not as the defeated, but as the saved. Among the peoples displaced to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar were the Jews, whose exile from their homeland in Judah had begun in the campaigns of 605, 597, and 587 BC. They had been in Babylon for 2 generations by the time Cyrus arrived. Within a year of his conquest, he authorized their return to Judah and the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. The book of Ezra records a proclamation in Cyrus's name, declaring that the God of heaven had charged him to rebuild the temple. The cylinder itself does not mention Jerusalem or the Jews specifically, but its general policy, the return of exiled peoples, the restoration of their sanctuaries, was applied consistently enough that the Jewish community understood themselves as its beneficiaries. In the Hebrew scripture, Cyrus is the only non-Jewish figure ever called the Anointed of God. The word used is Messiah. The empire Cyrus now held stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the first cataract of the Nile's tributaries. No single state had ever encompassed this much territory, this many peoples, or this many languages. Cyrus administered it from multiple capitals, Ecbatana for the north, Babylon for the west, Pasargadae, his new city in the Persian heartland, as the ceremonial center of Achaemenid power. He did not attempt to impose a uniform culture on the peoples he governed. He did not require them to speak Persian, worship Persian gods, or abandon their local institutions. He required taxes, military service, and loyalty to the throne. Beyond that, the empire was astonishingly permissive by any standard the ancient world had known. Pasargadae, the city Cyrus built at the site of his victory over the Medes in the plain of Fars, was unlike any capital the ancient Near East had produced. There was no massive defensive wall enclosing a dense urban center. Instead, across a broad plain watered by streams from the surrounding mountains, Cyrus built a series of palace pavilions set in a formal garden, the first recorded garden in the Persian tradition. Stone channels carried water in straight lines between the buildings. Cypress trees and flowering plants were arranged in geometric patterns around columned halls. The whole ensemble was open to the landscape rather than fortified against it. A king who ruled half the world apparently preferred to sit in a garden and let the mountains watch over him. Cyrus did not stop expanding. After Babylon, he continued pushing the empire's northeastern frontier deeper into Central Asia, campaigning along the rivers of what is now Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, establishing fortified points and extracting the loyalty of the steppe peoples along the empire's edge. It was on one of these campaigns, in 530 BC, that he met his end. He was pushing into the territory of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic Iranian peoples east of the Caspian Sea, led by their queen, Tomyris. After an initial Persian success that involved trapping a Massagetæ force with wine left in an abandoned camp, Tomyris's army rallied, and in a second engagement, the Persians were routed. Cyrus died in the fighting. He was almost certainly in his late 60s. His body was brought back to Pasargadae and laid in the tomb he had prepared for himself, a simple gabled chamber of white limestone set on a stepped plinth in the middle of the garden city he had built. When Alexander the Great visited the tomb nearly 2 centuries later, he found it already looted, the golden sarcophagus stripped, the jewelry and weapons gone. What remained, according to the account preserved by Arrian, was an inscription in the Persian script. The exact wording varies between sources, but its substance is consistent. It said, in effect, that whoever you are, and however much power you hold, you are looking at the resting place of a man who once held more. The instruction it contained was simple. Do not disturb it. The man who ordered those words carved had governed nearly half of humanity. He had done it in the main without terror. And the world he left behind was, in almost every measurable way, more stable than the one he had found. The question his successors would spend 2 centuries answering was whether what he had built was a system or a personality, whether the tolerance, the administrative flexibility, the willingness to let conquered peoples remain themselves, whether all of that was the product of a coherent governing philosophy that could survive him, or whether it was simply the expression of one extraordinary man's instincts. Cambyses, his son, would soon suggest one answer. Darius the Great would provide another, more durable one. But the foundation was Cyrus's, the idea that an empire could hold the world together not by erasing the differences between its peoples, but by finding a way to make those differences governable. It was, in the ancient world, a genuinely new thought. Every empire that came before Persia had operated on a version of the same basic assumption, that the people you conquered needed to become, in some meaningful sense, like you. The Assyrians had deported millions and scrambled populations across their empire precisely to break the identities that made peoples dangerous, to dissolve the loyalties, the local priesthoods, the communal memories that had a habit of coalescing into revolt. The Babylonians had carried the Jews to Mesopotamia for the same reason. Even the more benign conquerors of the ancient Near East treated cultural distinctiveness as a problem to be managed, a friction to be reduced. Persia reversed the logic entirely. The distinctiveness of subject peoples was not a problem. It was, when handled correctly, a resource. The practical case for tolerance was overwhelming. The empire at its height stretched across 3 million square kilometers and contained somewhere between 40 and 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages and practicing dozens of religions across terrain ranging from the Nile Delta to the Hindu Kush. No army could hold that by force alone. No single administrative language could reach all of it. No single set of laws could map cleanly onto the legal traditions of Babylon, Egypt, Judah, Lydia, and Bactria simultaneously. The Persian solution was to accept this complexity as a given rather than fight it, and to build a governing structure flexible enough to work within it rather than against it. The satrap sat at the center of that structure. The word itself was Persian, Kshatrapavan, as protector of the province, and the office it described was the empire's primary instrument of local governance. Each satrapy was a largely self-contained administrative unit responsible for its own internal order, its own tax collection, and its own military levies. The satrap who governed it had the authority of the king within his territory on most day-to-day matters. He administered justice. He managed the regional economy. He oversaw the maintenance of roads, canals, and the agricultural infrastructure that kept the province productive. Within those broad responsibilities, he had considerable latitude to work with local customs, local elites, and local legal traditions rather than replacing them. The satrap was almost always Persian or Median, a member of the royal family or the high nobility, is someone whose loyalty to the throne was structural rather than merely personal. But beneath him, the actual administrative machinery of each province ran largely on local expertise. Babylonian scribes kept the records in Babylonian. Egyptian priests managed the temples in Egyptian. The existing tax assessment systems, the existing land tenure arrangements, the existing trade regulations, all of these were inherited and absorbed rather than replaced. A farmer in the Nile Delta in 500 BC paid his taxes to a Persian-appointed governor, but the man who came to assess his fields, record the yield, and calculate what was owed was almost certainly Egyptian, working within a tradition of land administration that stretched back centuries before any Persian had set foot in Egypt. Aramaic was the thread that held the administrative fabric together. It was not a Persian language. It had originated among the Semitic peoples of the Levant and had already spread widely across the Near East under the Assyrians and Babylonians as a language of trade and diplomacy. The Persians adopted it as the empire's working administrative language precisely because it was already understood across the breadth of their territory. A royal decree issued at Susa could be written in Aramaic and reach officials in Egypt, Anatolia, Bactria, and Babylonia without requiring translation into half a dozen separate languages. Old Persian was reserved for ceremonial inscriptions and the language of the royal court. Aramaic was the language in which the empire actually ran. Alongside the satrap, the king placed two other officials whose authority was deliberately kept separate. A treasurer reported directly to the throne on the province's financial flows, independent of the satrap's oversight. A garrison commander held the military forces stationed in the province and answered to the king's military chain of command. The three posts were a deliberate structural check. No single figure in any province could combine financial, administrative, and military authority in a way that made rebellion straightforward. Above all of them, at irregular intervals, came the royal inspectors, men known in the Persian court as the king's eyes and ears. Traveling officials who moved through the provinces unannounced, audited the satrap's administration, heard complaints from the local population, and reported directly to the king. A satrap who was skimming the treasury, oppressing local populations, or cultivating an independent power base, could not easily hide it. The religious policy was the most visible expression of the governing philosophy. Wherever Persian authority extended, the local cults continued to function. Temple estates kept their lands. Priests kept their revenues. The festivals, the sacrifices, the ritual calendars that had organized community life in Babylon, Memphis, Jerusalem, and Sardis for centuries carried on without interruption. The Persian kings did not merely tolerate this. They actively patronized it. Darius funded the restoration of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He wrote personally to a provincial official in western Anatolia, ordering the restoration of a Greek sanctuary that the official had apparently disrupted. Cambyses, before his reputation collapsed, made offerings to the Egyptian god Apis, yet the pattern was consistent enough across enough reigns to be something more than personal piety. It was policy, and it was working. What made this policy genuinely sophisticated was its understanding of where legitimacy actually came from. In every ancient society the Persians encountered, the priesthood was not simply a religious institution. It was an administrative one, the manager of temple lands, the keeper of records, the creditor of farmers, the organizer of communal labor. The priests of Marduk in Babylon held an authority over the Babylonian population that no Persian army could replicate. The priests of Amun in Egypt commanded a loyalty that ran deeper than any political allegiance. When Cyrus presented himself in Babylon as the chosen agent of Marduk, he was not simply performing a religious ritual. He was inserting himself into the existing structure of Babylonian legitimacy, acquiring the endorsement of the institution that Babylonians actually trusted. Tolerance was not simply kindness. It was an extremely precise instrument of political incorporation. The coinage system added an economic layer to the administrative one. Darius introduced the gold daric, a coin bearing the image of the king as an archer, as the empire's standard currency for large transactions, alongside a silver shekel for everyday trade. For the first time in the Near East's history, a merchant in Sardis and a merchant in Susa could conduct a transaction using the same medium of exchange, governed by the same weights and measures, enforceable through the same imperial legal framework. The great trading families of Babylon, the Marashu house being the most documented, operated banking and credit networks across the empire's provinces, and the standardization of currency made those networks vastly more efficient. Trade between peoples who had never met, speaking different languages and worshiping different gods, could happen reliably because the Persian administrative system provided the infrastructure of trust that commerce required. None of this was without its tensions and its failures. The tolerance was real, but it was also conditional. It held as long as the taxes were paid and the loyalty was maintained. Provinces that revolted discovered quickly that the Persian approach to rebellion was not gentle. Darius suppressed 19 revolts in his first 2 years on the throne. When Babylon rose against him twice, And he eventually stripped the city of its special administrative status and reduced it to an ordinary province. Egypt rebelled repeatedly and was reconquered repeatedly, with each cycle leaving a residue of mutual bitterness that eroded the original goodwill on both sides. The system was not idealism. It was a calculated bargain. We will leave your world intact, and you will pay us and remain quiet. When one side of that bargain broke down, the other side did too. What distinguished the Persian system from everything that had come before it was not that it was free of coercion, no empire is, but that coercion was its last resort rather than its first. The Assyrians had led with terror and used administration to consolidate what terror had seized. The Persians led with administration and used force to defend what administration had built. The distinction seems subtle until you measure the outcomes. The Assyrian Empire lasted at its height of coherent function, perhaps a century and a half before it tore itself apart. The Achaemenid system, with all its fractures and rebellions and periods of internal decay, held together for more than 200 years across a territory and a population that dwarfed anything Assyria had ever governed. The idea of Persia, that an empire could be held by being willing to leave people alone, was not a moral philosophy. It was a technology of governance, and it worked. Cambyses inherited an empire that no single man had ever governed before, and he inherited it at 30 years old, with his father barely cold in his tomb at Pasargadae. He had been groomed for the role. Cyrus had made him regent in Babylon years earlier, and he had performed the ritual duties of Babylonian kingship at the New Year festival with enough competence that the city's priests had accepted him. He understood, at least in principle, what the empire required of a king: presence, decisiveness, and the projection of legitimate authority across territories so vast that most of them would never see his face. What he had not yet demonstrated was whether he possessed the quality that had made his father irreplaceable, the instinct for knowing when conquest and restraint needed to operate together and which one the moment demanded. His first independent act as king was to have his younger brother Bardia killed. Bardia was almost certainly next in line, and Cambyses almost certainly feared him as a rival. The murder was carried out in secret, and so effectively that the Persian nobility did not know whether Bardia was alive or dead. Cambyses told no one. He departed for Egypt with the secret sealed inside the court, and the fragility that secret created would eventually destroy him. Egypt was the last major independent power in the ancient Near East, and its conquest had been part of Persian planning since the reign of Cyrus. The pharaoh Cambyses II had prepared as carefully as he could, hiring Greek mercenaries, building up the frontier defenses, cultivating alliances with the island states of the Aegean. He died in 526 BC before the invasion came, leaving his son Psamtik III on the throne for what would prove to be a reign of less than a year. Cambyses crossed the Sinai Desert in the spring of 525 BC with logistical support from Arabian chiefs who controlled the desert water routes, and with military intelligence from a Greek general named Phanes of Halicarnassus, who had defected from Egyptian service and knew exactly where the defenses were weakest. Before the Persian army had crossed the last stretch of desert, it already knew more about the Egyptian position than most of the Egyptian commanders. The decisive engagement came at Pelusium, the fortress city on Egypt's eastern frontier, where the Nile Delta met the sea. The Egyptians and their Greek mercenaries held a strong position, and the battle that followed was fierce enough that Herodotus, visiting the site decades later, found the plain around it still scattered with bones. The Egyptians broke and retreated toward Memphis. Cambyses followed, besieged the city, and took it within weeks. Psamtik III was captured, taken to Susa, and later executed when he was discovered organizing a revolt from captivity. The Libyan tribes to the west submitted immediately, sending tribute without requiring a campaign. The Greek colonies along the Libyan coast followed. In a single season, the empire had added the oldest continuous civilization in the world. Cambyses entered Sais, Egypt's capital, and had himself crowned pharaoh in the temple of the goddess Neith, observing the required rituals and taking on an Egyptian throne name. He followed the same playbook that had worked in Babylon, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate successor within the Egyptian religious and political tradition. An Egyptian official named Ujahorisnet, who had served the previous pharaoh and crossed to the Persian side before the battle, became his chief physician and close advisor, helping him navigate the complexities of Egyptian court protocol. The priesthoods received their revenues. The temples stayed open. On the surface, the transition of power followed the pattern Cyrus had established. Then, Cambyses pushed further, and the empire began to show him its limits. He planned 3 simultaneous expansions from Egypt, southwest into Nubia, west across the desert to the Siwa oasis, and across the Mediterranean against Carthage. The Carthaginian campaign never began. His Phoenician sailors refused to attack a city founded by Phoenicians, and without their fleet, Cambyses had no means of crossing the sea in force. The western desert expedition sent toward Siwa disappeared entirely. An army of 50,000 men marched west from Thebes and was never seen again, consumed, almost certainly, by a catastrophic sandstorm somewhere in the open desert. The Nubian campaign reached into the northern territories and achieved some results, but stalled badly when supplies ran out, forcing Cambyses to turn back with his army already weakened by hunger. The military frustrations left a mark. The Egypt that Cambyses governed after his failed expansions was an unhappier place than the Egypt he had entered. Stories circulated, some probably genuine, some almost certainly embellished by hostile Egyptian and Greek sources, of temples looted, of the sacred Apis bull stabbed, of royal tombs desecrated, and the mummified bodies of former pharaohs burned. How much of this was true is genuinely uncertain. The one Egyptian source that survives from Cambyses' own time, the priest Ujahorisnet, describes a king who restored temple revenues and drove out unauthorized squatters from sacred precincts. Herodotus describes a madman who murdered sacred animals for sport. The truth was probably somewhere between the two. A king under mounting pressure, making increasingly poor decisions, losing the administrative patience that his father had built the empire on. In March 522 BC, while Cambyses was still in Egypt dealing with the aftermath of his campaigns, a man in Persia announced that he was Bardia, son of Cyrus, and declared himself king. Within weeks, he had support across Media, Persia, and the eastern provinces. The man who had been secretly killed years earlier was, now as far as most of the empire knew, still alive. And now he was offering 3 years free from taxes and military levies, which was a proposal that found a warm reception in provinces that had been squeezed hard to fund Cambyses' Egyptian adventure. Whether this Bardia was truly an impersonator named Gaumata, as Darius would later insist in the Behistun inscription, or whether he was actually the real Bardia, and Darius later invented the impersonation story to justify his own seizure of power. That question has never been definitively settled. What is certain is that the revolt was real, the support was broad, and the empire was teetering. Cambyses left Egypt immediately. He organized the province into a proper satrapy under a Persian governor and marched north through the Levant toward the Persian heartland. Somewhere in Syria, as in the summer of 522 BC, he was dead. The cause is disputed across every source that records it. A sword wound to the thigh that turned gangrenous, possibly self-inflicted. A deliberate suicide on hearing the full scale of the revolt. Possibly murder, though the evidence for that is thin. He died childless in his late 30s in a provincial town in Syria, far from the empire he had spent his whole adult life serving. The direct male line of Cyrus was finished. The empire Cambyses left behind was structurally intact but politically volatile. The revolt in the east continued. The new king, whoever he was, held court in Media, offering concessions, gathering support, and buying time. In the Persian heartland, a group of 7 Persian nobles, each from the high aristocracy, were watching and calculating. One of them was Darius, the son of Hystaspes, a member of a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family who had served as Cambyses' lance-bearer in Egypt. He was, by his own account, a man who understood that the moment required not patience, but action. In September 522 BC, the 7 conspirators located the new king at a fortified house on the Nisaean plain in Media, forced their way in, and killed him. What happened in that room on that night was the hinge on which the entire future of the Persian Empire turned. The 7 conspirators who killed the man on the Nisaean plain in September 522 BC did not agree on what happened next. They had a common enemy and a shared interest in removing him. But beyond that, their positions diverged. According to Herodotus, they debated openly whether the moment called for oligarchy, democracy in some Persian form, anarchy or monarchy, a conversation that reads as almost impossibly philosophical given that the body was barely cold. What is clear is that Darius walked out of that room as king. Whether by prior arrangement, political maneuvering, or sheer force of character, the man who had served as Cambyses' spear carrier in Egypt was now the Shahanshah. He was probably in his late 20s. He had, by his own later account, a slender claim to the Achaemenid bloodline through a collateral branch of the family. What he had in much greater abundance was intelligence, ambition, and an utterly clear understanding of what the empire needed. What it needed first was survival. Within weeks of Darius taking the throne, revolts broke out across the empire on a scale that would have destroyed a less capable ruler entirely. Elam rose. Babylonia rose, with a pretender claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar. Persia itself rose. Media rose, with a rebel claiming descent from the old Median royal house. Parthia, Margiana, Assyria, Egypt, Sagartia, and Saka territory all followed. By late 522 BC, most of the empire was in open revolt. Darius held, with any confidence, only a core of loyal Persian and Median troops around him. He fought back with a speed and personal energy that his own inscription at Behistun describes in meticulous detail. 19 battles in a single year, ending in December 521 BC, 9 rebel kings captured. The inscription may contain its share of royal embellishment, but the military reality it describes, a young king fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, moving between theaters faster than his enemies could coordinate, is confirmed by the broad pattern of events that followed. By 520 BC, the empire was his. What Darius did next separated him permanently from every ruler who had held the Persian throne before him. He did not simply restore order and continue governing as his predecessors had. He sat down and redesigned the empire from its foundations. Cyrus had built with instinct and genius, solving problems as they arose, leaving the administrative structure largely improvised. Cambyses had inherited that improvisation and added nothing systematic to it. Darius looked at what he had inherited, a vast, diverse, polyglot empire held together partly by prestige, partly by fear, and partly by the personal loyalty networks of the provincial governors. And he set about replacing its improvised structures with designed ones. What emerged was the first true imperial bureaucracy in history. The satrapy system that Darius formalized divided the empire into approximately 20 provinces, each assessed for its own fixed annual tribute rather than the variable gift-giving and informal extraction that had preceded it. Babylon, the richest province, paid 1,000 silver talents annually. Egypt owed grain in addition to silver. India, in the east, paid gold dust. Each assessment was calibrated to the economic capacity of the region. Darius had his officials survey agricultural land, measure yields, and calculate what a province could sustain without destroying its productive base. A farmer in the Nile Delta knew exactly what his satrapy owed each year. The arbitrariness that had made the previous system resented was replaced by a fixed obligation that, while not light, was at least predictable. The royal road was Darius's most visible infrastructure achievement, but calling it a road understates what it was. The route itself, running roughly 2,700 kilometers from Susa in southwestern Iran to Sardis in western Anatolia, followed paths that had been in use for centuries. What Darius built was the system layered on top of those paths, a series of approximately 111 way stations spaced at regular intervals along the route, each one staffed, supplied, and equipped with fresh horses. A royal courier carrying dispatches could cover the full distance from Sardis to Susa in approximately 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months on foot. Messages moved at the speed of horses, changed at every station, and they moved day and night. For the first time in the Near East's history, a king in his capital could receive news from the empire's western edge in less than a week. The courier system was not only for messages. The way stations issued authorization tablets, clay documents stamped with official seals, that entitled government travelers to daily rations of food, wine, beer, and fodder for their animals, drawn from the provincial stores at each station along their route. Tens of thousands of these tablets have survived from the Persepolis archive, and they reveal the empire's administrative nervous system in extraordinary detail. An inspector traveling from Persepolis to Media drew his rations at each station. A delegation of Indian workers traveling west to build at Susa drew theirs. A royal prince, moving with his household between capitals, drew rations scaled to his rank and the size of his entourage. The system knew where everyone was and what they were owed, and it kept the records to prove it. Darius introduced the gold daric, a coin bearing the image of the king as a running archer, as the empire's standard currency for large transactions, supplemented by a silver siglos for smaller ones. The daric was minted only at royal centers under direct royal control, which meant that its weight and purity were guaranteed by the throne itself. It circulated well beyond the empire's borders, reaching as far as the Greek world and the Celtic fringes of Europe, because merchants everywhere understood that a daric was a daric. Its value was not dependent on the reputation of the local market, but on the authority of the Persian king. In a world where trade had always been complicated by the need to verify the weight and purity of whatever metal was changing hands, the standardized imperial coin was a profound simplification. It made commerce faster, cheaper, and more reliable across an enormous geographic range. The legal reforms Darius introduced gave the empire its first consistent framework of imperial law, operating alongside the existing local legal traditions of each province. Royal judges, appointed by the crown and answerable directly to it, traveled circuits within their assigned territories, hearing cases of particular importance. A dispute between a Babylonian merchant and an Egyptian one, or between a local governor and a temple estate, could now be referred upward to an imperial standard rather than resolved entirely within the competing frameworks of two different local traditions. Local laws, Babylonian, Egyptian, Jewish, Lydian, continued to govern everyday life within each community. The imperial layer sat above them, providing a framework for the cases that crossed community boundaries or involved the interests of the state. Darius commissioned the carving of the Behistun inscription within years of taking the throne. A massive trilingual text cut into a limestone cliff face 100 meters above the ancient road connecting Babylon to Ecbatana, visible to every caravan passing below. Written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, it recorded his ancestry, his seizure of power, the rebellions he had suppressed, and the 19 battles he had won. At its foot stood a carved relief. Darius, with his foot on the chest of the defeated pretender, 9 rebel leaders standing bound before him, and the winged figure of Ahura Mazda floating above, conferring divine approval. The choice of 3 languages was deliberate. The inscription spoke simultaneously to the Persian court, the Elamite administrative class, and the Babylonian literate world. It was, among other things, an act of communication at imperial scale, telling everyone who mattered that the question of who ruled was settled. His building program announced the same thing in stone. At Susa, the ancient Elamite capital that Darius adopted as his primary administrative center, he rebuilt the royal palace on a scale designed to impress every delegation and ambassador who passed through its gates. An inscription he left there described the workforce in terms that serve as their own testimony to the empire's reach. The cedar came from Lebanon, the gold from Sardis and Bactria, the lapis lazuli and carnelian from Sogdia, the silver and ebony from Egypt, the ivory from Ethiopia and India, the stone columns from Elam, the craftsmen from Ionia and Sardis. The palace at Susa was not built by Persians. It was built by the empire, drawn from every corner of the world that empire contained, assembled in one place and shaped into a monument to the idea of Persia. The military campaigns of Darius's middle reign pushed the empire to its greatest territorial extent. He pushed east to the Indus River around 515 BC, establishing Persian authority over the Gandharan and Sindhu territories of what is now northwestern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and adding their tribute to the imperial rolls. He campaigned north of the Black Sea into Scythian territory in 513 BC, a massive and ultimately inconclusive expedition that marched a large army across the Danube into the steppes and found nothing solid to fight, since the Scythians simply withdrew and refused engagement. Darius withdrew after weeks of fruitless pursuit, having demonstrated the reach of Persian power without achieving its decisive application. He had, however, used the Scythian campaign to bring Thrace and Macedonia into the Persian sphere of influence, extending the empire's shadow deep into the European world. The Greek problem emerged not as a clash of civilizations, but as a piece of routine administration that got out of hand. The Ionian Greek cities along the Aegean coast of Anatolia had been Persian subjects since Cyrus. They paid their tribute, provided ships for the imperial fleet, and were governed, by and large, through local tyrants whom the Persians found convenient and the Greek citizens frequently resented. In 499 BC, a combination of Greek political frustrations and the personal ambitions of Miletus's leader Aristagoras produced the Ionian Revolt. The rebel cities appealed to mainland Greece for help. Sparta declined. Athens and the small city of Eretria each sent a modest fleet, and the rebels made it as far as Sardis, burned the lower city, and were eventually crushed by 493 BC. Darius took careful note of which mainland Greek cities had sent ships. His response to Marathon in 490 BC, a Persian expeditionary force that crossed the Aegean, landed in Attica and was defeated by an Athenian army on the coastal plain, is usually told as a Greek triumph and the beginning of the Persian decline in the west. From the Persian vantage point, the episode looked different. The expedition was a punitive raid directed at Athens and Eretria for their role in the Ionian Revolt, not an attempt to conquer all of Greece. It failed. That was a problem that required a solution, and Darius began preparing a larger campaign immediately. He died in 486 BC before it was ready, leaving the expedition and the empire to his son. 4 years after Marathon, the Greek world was still very much part of Darius's unfinished business. Darius died at roughly 60 years of age, having reigned for 36 years. He was buried at Nakshi Rostam, a rock face 6 kilometers north of Persepolis, where his tomb was cut high into the cliff in the shape of a cross, its facade carved with a scene of the king standing before a fire altar with Ahura Mazda above him, and the representatives of the empire's subject peoples carved below, supporting the royal throne on their raised arms. The carved figures beneath the throne were not there to express submission. They were there to express the empire itself, the plurality of peoples whose combined strength held up the world the king stood in. It was the most precise visual statement of what Darius had built. Not a Persian kingdom, but a structure whose very substance was the diversity of the world it contained. 50 kilometers northeast of what is now the city of Shiraz, at the foot of a mountain called Kuh-e-Rihmat, the Mountain of Mercy, the ground rises in a great artificial terrace above the Marvdasht plain. The terrace is roughly 450 meters long and 300 meters wide, its retaining walls in places rising 15 meters above the surrounding plain. It is not a natural formation. Workers cut into living bedrock, filled depressions with rubble and compacted earth, and faced the whole structure with enormous limestone blocks dressed so precisely that mortar was unnecessary. The result was a flat, engineered platform rising out of the plain like a stage that the landscape itself had been arranged to frame. When Darius marked this site around 518 BC and ordered construction to begin, he was building on ground that had been made, not found. The empire that would be displayed here was itself a made thing, and its capital would announce that from the first moment of approach. Persepolis was not a city in the way that Babylon or Memphis was a city. There were no dense residential quarters spreading beyond the terrace walls, no permanent market districts, no population of tens of thousands living their daily lives in its streets. The terrace contained palaces, audience halls, a treasury, administrative buildings, and the quarters of the royal household. And outside it, some ancillary structures and storage. Beyond that, the Marvdasht plain stretched away largely empty. Persepolis was occupied seasonally, primarily in spring. And for most of the year it stood quiet above the plain, with only a maintenance staff and garrison in residence. This was not a failure of ambition. It was the entire point. Persepolis was not built to be lived in. It was built to be arrived at. The approach began at the Great Staircase, a broad double flight of steps ascending to the terrace level, each step low and wide enough that a man on horseback could ride up without dismounting. The width was deliberate. A visitor climbing those stairs was not hurrying. He was ascending slowly, one measured step at a time, with the mountain above him and the plain receding below, and the scale of the terrace gradually revealing itself as he rose. By the time he reached the top, he had been walking through an architectural argument for several minutes, an argument whose conclusion was the same as the inscriptions Darius had carved into every doorway. There is one king, and you are in his house. At the head of the staircase stood the Gate of All Nations, built by Xerxes. It was a square hall, approximately 25 meters across, its roof supported by 4 columns, its western entrance flanked by a pair of colossal bull figures with human heads, Lamassu, in the tradition inherited from Assyria, guardians of the threshold between the outer world and the inner one. The eastern entrance was flanked by a different pair, human-headed, winged lions. Every delegation, every ambassador, every provincial governor arriving at Persepolis passed through this gate. Xerxes left his own inscription on it, one in 3 languages, stating that he had built it and that Ahura Mazda had protected both him and his work. The gate was the first thing you saw after climbing the stairs, and it told you everything about the world you were entering: ancient, guarded, multilingual, and absolute. Beyond the Gate of All Nations lay the Apadana, the great audience hall of Darius and Xerxes, the largest building on the terrace and the centerpiece of everything Persepolis was designed to accomplish. It was a hypostyle hall, a vast roofed space whose ceiling was carried by columns rather than walls, 72 of them in total, each one standing 24 meters high, their capitals formed as the foreparts of twin-headed bulls or eagles, the crossbeams resting in the saddle between the 2 heads. The hall's footprint covered roughly 1,000 square meters. When it was full, with the columns receding into the distance in every direction and the ceiling lost in the shadows above, it produced an effect that no building the ancient world had previously attempted, not the grandeur of mass like the Egyptian temples at Karnak, but the grandeur of space, of a human-made interior so vast that it unmade the ordinary sense of enclosure. The stairways leading up to the Apadana's eastern and northern facades were faced with some of the most detailed carved relief sculpture the ancient world produced. In registers running the full length of the stairways, the subject peoples of the empire proceeded in procession toward the king. 23 delegations, each one identified by costume, hairstyle, tribute, and the animals they led. The Lydians brought vessels and a chariot drawn by horses. The Babylonians led a humped bull and carried cloth and cups. The Indians brought gold dust in vessels and led a donkey. The Ethiopians carried elephant tusks and an okapi. The Scythians led a horse and carried folded cloth and bracelets. Every delegation was carved with the same formal composure, the same measured pace, the same respectful but unhumiliated bearing. These were not prisoners. They were the empire coming to pay its respects. Each spring, the reality those carvings depicted actually arrived at Persepolis. No ruse. The Persian New Year, celebrated at the spring equinox, was the occasion that gathered the empire's peoples onto the terrace in living form. Delegations from every province made the journey to Persepolis with their tribute: silver, gold, animals, in textiles, luxury goods, and the specific products of their region. The Persepolis fortification tablets record the ration allocations for these delegations in extraordinary detail. So many liters of grain per day for an Indian party of a given size, so many jars of wine for a Babylonian delegation. The tablets cover the years between 509 and 494 BC and record transactions involving workers and travelers from at least 28 different nations. On the terrace above the Marvdasht plain once a year, the world that the relief sculptures depicted actually assembled in flesh. The treasury behind the audience halls held what the empire accumulated. Tribute in silver and gold flowed into Persepolis and stayed there, not circulated, not spent on trade or infrastructure, but stored in the form of bullion and finished objects in rooms that grew larger and more numerous with each reign. When Alexander's army reached Persepolis in 330 BC and broke open the treasury, it took an estimated 120,000 talents of silver, requiring thousands of mules and camels to carry it away. The Greek historian Diodorus described the wealth as almost beyond calculation. The storage of that much silver in one place had its own macroeconomic consequence. By withdrawing so much metal from active circulation across the empire, the Persian treasury almost certainly contributed to deflationary pressure in the wider Near Eastern economy. The Persians were not economists in any modern sense, but they had discovered, by accumulation, one of the ways in which an empire can simultaneously hold wealth and suppress the commercial vitality of the world it governs. The private palaces on the terrace were smaller and more intimate than the Apadana, but their finish was equally precise. The Dashara, the winter palace of Darius, completed by Xerxes, had polished black limestone floors that reflected the light from the doorways. Its door jambs were carved with images of the king, attended by servants carrying fly whisks and parasols. The stonework throughout the complex bore the marks of craftsmen from across the empire. Ionian Greeks carved the column capitals. Babylonians shaped the brickwork on the terrace walls. Egyptians worked the decorative elements in faience. An inscription Darius left at Susa describing that palace's construction listed the origin of every material and every class of craftsmen involved. He wanted the world to know what building this had required, because what it had required was the whole world. 2.5 centuries after Darius marked the site on the Marvdasht plain, Persepolis burned. Alexander's army looted the treasury, And by the accounts of every source that records it, the fire that consumed the palace complex followed, deliberately or in the chaos of a night's drunken celebration. The sources disagree, but the outcome does not. The cedar columns and timber roofs that carried the Apadana's ceiling fed a fire that could be seen for miles across the plain. When it was over, the columns still stood. Stone cannot burn, but everything they had held up was gone. The delegations from 23 nations carved on the stairways survived, frozen in their eternal procession toward a king who no longer existed, in a building that was no longer there. They are still there now, in the same posture, still arriving, still bearing their gifts, at the foot of columns that hold up nothing but the open sky. Around 500 BC, the Persian Empire contained approximately 50 million people. The figure is an estimate. The ancient world had no census machinery capable of counting the whole, but it is a considered one, and what it represents is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. 50 million people dispersed across 5.5 million square kilometers, speaking perhaps 24 major languages and scores of dialects. Farming every type of terrain from the Nile floodplain to the alluvial fields of Mesopotamia to the high valleys of Bactria, worshipping gods whose names most of them had never heard and could not have pronounced. 1 in every 2 human beings alive anywhere in the world at that moment lived inside the empire's borders, paid its taxes, walked its roads, and ate grain whose yield had been measured, recorded, and assessed by a Persian-trained official with a clay tablet and a stylus. This was not a confederacy. It was not a sphere of influence. It was a single administrative structure, and it functioned. You are a farmer in the Nile Delta in 490 BC. Your world is the same world your grandfather knew. The same black soil left by the annual flood, the same rhythm of planting and harvest, and the same temples to Osiris and Isis rising above the flat plain along the river's edge. The overseer who comes to assess your field speaks Egyptian. The official who records the assessment writes on papyrus in Aramaic, which you cannot read. Somewhere north of you, in Memphis, a Persian satrap governs the province from a palace that looks very much like a Persian palace, surrounded by Egyptian administrators who handle everything his Persian staff cannot. At Novruz, a delegation from Egypt will travel to Persepolis carrying fine linen and gold jewelry and leading a bull chosen for the quality of its horns. You will not go. You will plant barley, harvest it, keep most of it, and pay the rest. The empire is real, but it is also, for most of the year, almost invisible. The Babylonian world had changed less than its new rulers. The great cities of the lower Euphrates, Babylon itself, Nippur, Uruk, continued their commercial lives under Persian rule with a fluency that suggests genuine continuity rather than disruption. The Murashu family of Nippur, whose business archives from the mid-5th century BC have survived in extraordinary completeness, ran a financial enterprise that leased land, extended credit, managed water rights, and handled tax payments on behalf of large numbers of people who apparently found it easier to deal with the Murashus than with the imperial administration directly. Their clients included Babylonians, Persians, Jews, Arameans, and Egyptians. Their tablets were written in Babylonian cuneiform. Their transactions involved silver assessed in the imperial standard. The empire had not replaced the Babylonian economy, and it had given the Babylonian economy a wider arena in which to operate. The roads were the empire's circulatory system, and they carried far more than royal couriers and tax assessments. Merchants moved along the royal road and its branches continuously, their caravans laden with whatever the differential in prices between provinces made profitable to shift. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, moved west toward the courts and temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where it was worth its weight in silver. Tin from the highland deposits of the Iranian Plateau moved in the same direction toward the metalworkers of the Levant. grain from the Nile Valley and Mesopotamia moved east toward the more arid provinces of the Iranian Plateau. Textiles woven in Babylon and fine wool from the Plateau moved in every direction at once. The Persian roads had not created this commerce. Many of these routes were ancient, but the security the empire imposed on them, the elimination of the brigandage that had periodically made long-distance trade a gamble with one's life, had expanded it to a scale that was genuinely new. Darius's completion of the canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, following an older pharaonic project that had been abandoned, opened a maritime route that changed the geometry of Indian Ocean trade. Ships carrying spices, cotton, and ivory from the coasts of Arabia and India could now sail through the Red Sea, enter the canal, and reach the Mediterranean without unloading their cargo and carrying it overland across the Sinai. The canal was broad enough for 2 warships to pass each other. It could be transited in 4 days. For the merchants of the Phoenician ports, Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, who dominated the Mediterranean's long-distance sea trade, it was a transformation as significant as any road. The Persian Empire had, almost incidentally, connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean for the first time in history. The Phoenicians deserve a moment of their own. They were the empire's maritime arm, the skilled sailors, shipbuilders, and long-distance traders who gave Persia a naval capability it could not have built from its own inland traditions. Their cities remained largely self-governing under Persian suzerainty. Their merchant fleets continued to range across the Mediterranean from the Levantine coast to the Atlantic, and their relationship with the Persian throne was more partnership than subjugation. When Persia needed a navy, it needed Phoenicia. The Persian king understood this clearly enough that the Phoenician cities received consistently favorable treatment throughout the Achaemenid period. Sidon in particular grew extraordinarily wealthy during the 5th century BC, its craftsmen producing metalwork, glass, and carved ivory of a quality that circulated across the entire Mediterranean world. The empire's tolerance of local elites was, in the Phoenician case, also the empire's maritime strategy. The peoples of the eastern provinces, Bactria, Sogdia, Gandhara, the territories around the Indus, lived inside the empire at its furthest frontier, where Persian administrative reach thinned to its minimum. Now, the satrap of Bactria governed from Bactra, a city in the fertile valley of the Oxus River in what is now northern Afghanistan, and his authority probably diminished steadily the further from Bactra one moved. The steppe nomads to the north paid tribute when Persian military pressure was present and ignored the empire when it was not. The settled farmers of Gandhara in the valleys around what is now Peshawar grew rice and wheat and cotton, maintained their own religious traditions. Early forms of what would eventually develop into Buddhism were taking shape in this world, and were incorporated into the empire as a satrapy that paid its gold dust and was otherwise left largely to itself. They were Persian subjects in the sense that they paid and that an official somewhere had their province on a list. In every other sense, they were themselves. The empire's soldiers came from everywhere. The Achaemenid military was arguably the most ethnically diverse fighting force the ancient world had ever assembled, not because Persia lacked its own warriors, but because the empire's scale and its administrative sophistication made it possible to draw on the particular military specializations of different peoples in combination. Persian and Median nobles formed the cavalry backbone and the officer class. The Immortals, an elite infantry unit of 10,000 men drawn exclusively from Persian and Median troops, maintained at exactly that number regardless of losses, formed the army's prestige corps. Lydian cavalry supplemented the Persian. Ionian Greeks provided technically skilled naval crews. Scythian and Saka horse archers operated on the flanks. Indian troops brought war elephants. Nubian soldiers carried bows of exceptional range. An army assembled for a major campaign was not a Persian army that happened to include foreigners. It was the empire-made military. the plurality of its peoples expressed in coordinated force. The women of the empire occupied a more complex position in its social fabric than the Greek sources, which is to say almost all the literary sources generally acknowledged. The Persepolis tablets reveal a working world in which women received ration allocations in their own names, managed households and estates, directed agricultural operations, and in some cases oversaw substantial workforces. The wives and daughters of the royal family held land grants and administered them through their own agents. A woman recorded in the tablets simply as a female overseer drew rations for herself and her workers at exactly the same rate as a male overseer of equivalent rank. Whether this represented genuine economic agency or simply the administrative recording of women who were managing property on behalf of absent male relatives is a question the tablets cannot fully answer. What they establish clearly is that the imperial economy ran, in part, on female labor and female management, and that the administrative system tracked both without apparent discomfort. The empire's gods were everywhere, and none of them were threatened by the others. In the same generation, the Jewish community in Elephantine and Upper Egypt maintained a temple to their god, while Egyptian priests conducted their own rituals in the temples down the road, while the Persian garrison worshipped at a fire altar, while Babylonian merchants in the same city made offerings to Marduk when the trading season had gone well. There is no record from this period of any Persian official ordering any of these communities to stop. There are records of Persian officials resolving disputes between religious communities, of royal funds directed to the restoration of damaged sanctuaries of multiple faiths, of the Persian crown presenting itself as the legitimate patron of local cults from one end of the empire to the other. The polytheism of the ancient world made this easier than a monotheistic system would have. No single god's exclusivity was at stake. But the Persians had turned what was merely a feature of ancient religious life into a deliberate and consistent governing strategy, and in doing so had built something that the world would not see again for a very long time. If you could stand somewhere above the empire in the years around 490 BC, on the terrace at Persepolis perhaps, watching a delegation climb the Great Staircase, you would see the specific texture of what it had achieved. People who had never shared a language, a god, or a meal were arriving together at the same place for the same purpose, walking in the same direction on the same road, governed by the same law, using the same coins. Behind them, and spread across 3 million square kilometers of extraordinarily varied terrain, 40 or 50 million lives continued in their own languages, under their own gods, with their own customs intact. The Persian Empire at its height was not a monoculture. It was the first successful experiment in governing human diversity at planetary scale, and the platform it built, the roads and canals and legal frameworks and administrative networks, would outlast it by centuries, continuing to shape the world long after the king who built them was a name carved into a cliff that most of the people traveling below it could not read. The war between Persia and Greece is the most famous military conflict of the ancient world, and it is famous almost entirely for the wrong reasons. It has been told, retold, and retold again as the story of a small and free civilization defeating a vast Eastern despotism, the outnumbered standing firm against the overwhelming, the democratic against the imperial, the individual against the herd. That telling is not without truth. The Greeks were outnumbered. They did win. What it omits is the perspective from which the conflict was not a clash of civilizations, but a provincial dispute at the western fringe of an empire that stretched to India. A disciplinary campaign against a set of small city-states that had burned a Persian city and needed to be reminded of the consequences. The men who ordered the campaigns against Greece were not dreaming of the submission of the free world. They were managing a border problem. The roots of the conflict reach back to 499 BC and the Ionian Revolt. The Greek cities of the Aegean coast of Anatolia had been Persian subjects since the reign of Cyrus, governed through local tyrants appointed by or acceptable to the Persian satrap. The arrangement produced resentment. The Ionian Greeks were proud of their independence, suspicious of tyranny in any form, and conscious that their cousins across the Aegean lived under no Persian authority at all. When Aristagoras, the ruler of Miletus, found himself in political difficulty after a failed joint expedition with the Persians against the island of Naxos, he turned his problem into a revolt. He abolished his own tyranny, declared himself a champion of Greek freedom, and sent envoys to mainland Greece asking for help. Sparta refused. Athens sent 20 ships, Eretria sent 5, and the rebel cities achieved one significant early success. They marched inland to Sardis, the seat of the western satrapy, and burned the lower city. The temple of the goddess Cybele burned with it, an act of sacrilege that the Persians noted carefully and did not forget. Within 2 years, the Athenian and Eretrian ships had gone home, leaving the Ionians to manage the consequences of a revolt they could not sustain alone. By 494 BC, the Persian counteroffensive had destroyed the rebel fleet at the Battle of Lade, razed Miletus, the revolt center, killed its adult male population, and deported its women and children to the east. The Ionian revolt was over. Darius immediately set about reforming the Ionian satrapy, imposing lower tribute rates and a more orderly system of governance. He then turned to the question of Athens and Eretria, which had helped start a fire that cost him considerable blood and treasure to extinguish. The first Persian expedition against mainland Greece in 492 BC, under Darius's son-in-law Mardonius, reached Thrace and Macedonia, both of which were absorbed into the Persian sphere, before a storm wrecked much of the fleet off the coast of Mount Athos, and the campaign was called off. A second expedition in 490 BC was more precisely targeted. A naval task force under the commanders Datis and Artaxerxes crossed the Aegean, subjugated the Cyclades, captured and burned Eretria after a siege of 6 days, deporting its population in direct repayment for Eretria's role in burning Sardis, and then sailed for Attica. Yet the force that landed in the bay at Marathon was not the full weight of Persian military power. It was a punitive expedition, large by Greek standards, modest by Persian ones. And its purpose was not the conquest of all Greece, but the punishment of Athens specifically. At Marathon, the Athenian general Miltiades understood something about Persian tactics that most Greek commanders had not yet worked out. The Persian infantry in the center was strong, the flanks were weaker. He thinned his own center and weighted his flanks, then attacked at a run, covering the killing ground quickly enough to deny the Persian archers their effective range. The Persian flanks collapsed. The center, suddenly enveloped, broke and fled to the ships. Approximately 6,400 Persians died on the plain. The Athenians lost 192 men. And the Persian fleet sailed around the cape toward Athens, hoping to find the city undefended while the army was still at Marathon. The Athenian army marched back across the mountain and arrived before the Persians could land. The fleet withdrew. By any Persian strategic calculation, the expedition had failed, and Darius began planning a far larger response. He died before it was ready. Xerxes inherited the Greek problem and the preparations for its resolution simultaneously. He also inherited an Egyptian revolt that demanded attention first. By the time Egypt was pacified and the army assembled for Greece, 4 years had passed since Marathon. What Xerxes launched in 480 BC was not a punitive raid, but a full imperial expedition, an army drawn from every corner of the empire, a fleet of Phoenician, Ionian, Egyptian, and Cilician ships numbering in the hundreds, and a logistical operation that had spent years stockpiling supplies at depots along the route through Thrace. A bridge of boats was built across the Hellespont, 2 parallel lines of ships lashed together with cables and planked over, so the army could cross from Asia to Europe without dividing. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes had the sea flogged and the engineers responsible beheaded. He built it again. The pass at Thermopylae was 300 Spartans and perhaps 7,000 allied Greek troops holding a narrow defile between the mountains and the sea against an army that may have numbered 100,000 or more. For 2 days they held it, fighting in rotation behind a wall they had repaired and widened, and using the terrain to eliminate the Persian advantage in numbers. On the third day, a local Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that came out behind the Greek position. Leonidas, the Spartan king, sent most of the allied forces south and held the pass with his 300 Spartans, a contingent of Thespians who refused to leave, and a group of Thebans who probably had little choice. They died to the last man. The pass was open, but it had cost 3 days, and the Athenian fleet to the north at Artemisium had used those 3 days to evaluate Persian naval tactics at close range and withdraw intact. Athens was evacuated. The women, children, and elderly were ferried across to the island of Salamis and the coast of the Argolid. When Xerxes' army entered the city, they found it largely empty. They burned it anyway. The Acropolis, the temples, the homes. The burning of Athens was not mindless destruction. It was the same logic that had governed the destruction of Eretria. You burned Sardis, we burn your city. The account was being settled. What the Persians had not counted on was Themistocles, the Athenian architect of a strategy that depended entirely on the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland. He needed the Persian fleet to enter those straits, and he needed them to enter before the Peloponnesian allies could convince the Greek commanders to withdraw further south. He sent a message to Xerxes, suggesting that the Greek fleet was about to flee. Xerxes sent his fleet in to block the exit. In the Straits of Salamis in September 480 BC, the Persian fleet lost its most important advantage, numbers, the moment it entered the confined water. The Phoenician and Ionian ships could not maneuver. They crowded each other. The heavier Greek triremes rammed into them in sequence, and the narrow water filled with disabled hulks that trapped the ships behind them. Xerxes watched from a throne set up on the shore, close enough to see the scale of what was happening. By the time the battle was over, the Persian fleet had lost somewhere between 200 and 300 ships. The campaign was not finished. Xerxes left Mardonius in Greece with a substantial land force and returned to Asia. But the naval superiority that had underwritten the entire operation was gone. The following spring, at Plateau, the Greek allied army under the Spartan regent Pausanias defeated Mardonius, who died in the fighting. The Persian land force broke and retreated north. From the Persian side of the ledger, the Greek campaigns were a failure at the margins of a functioning empire. No Persian province was lost. No trade route was disrupted. The Ionian cities remained Persian subjects. The tribute from 20 satrapies continued to flow into Persepolis and Susa without interruption. The court at Susa had problems in Egypt, problems in Babylonia, problems managing succession, problems administering 3 million square kilometers of extraordinarily diverse terrain. And in among all of those problems, Greece was the one that has consumed the majority of Western historical attention for 2.5 millennia. The asymmetry of how the conflict has been remembered is itself a historical phenomenon. Yes, and it is almost entirely a product of who wrote it down. The Greeks wrote it down in extraordinary detail, with enormous literary skill, and framed it as the most important event in the history of the world. From Persepolis, it looked like an expensive, unsuccessful border operation that the empire absorbed without breaking stride. What the wars did leave on the Persian side was a strategic lesson. After Plateau, no Persian army ever landed on the Greek mainland again. The instrument the empire reached for instead was gold. Persian money flowed into the Greek world in the decades after 479 BC, funding whichever city-state happened to be fighting whichever other city-state was currently posing a threat to Persian interests in the Aegean. When Sparta grew powerful enough to challenge Athenian dominance at sea, Persia backed Sparta. When Sparta grew powerful enough to threaten Persian authority in Ionia, Persia backed Thebes. The nearly unlimited financial resources of the Persian treasury made Greek politics a Persian instrument, and it worked with a precision that the military campaigns had never achieved. The Greeks spent the 5th and 4th centuries BC in an almost continuous cycle of warfare that consumed their wealth, their populations, and their political energy. Persia paid for much of it and watched from across the Aegean. The deepest consequence of the wars, though, was not military or political, but literary. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, born around 484 BC in a city that was itself a Persian subject, spent his adult life traveling through the empire's western territories, interviewing everyone he could find who had knowledge of the conflict. Denon produced in his histories a work of such scope, intelligence, and narrative power that it became the foundational text through which the entire ancient world understood what had happened. He was not biased against Persia in any simple sense. His treatment of Cyrus and Darius is often respectful, and he acknowledged the Persian sources he encountered. But his frame was Greek, his audience was Greek, and the story he told placed Greece at the center of the world's most consequential drama. That framing has never fully been displaced. Every subsequent account of the Persian Empire has had to contend with Herodotus first, which means that the empire of 50 million people governed across 3 million square kilometers now has been understood primarily through the eyes of the people who occupied its smallest corner and fought its least consequential war. Xerxes was born around 519 BC, the son of Darius and Atassa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great. His bloodline ran through both branches of the dynasty's founding generation, which is precisely why his father chose him as heir over his older half-brother Artaxerxes, who had been born before Darius became king. The argument Darius accepted, reportedly at the suggestion of a Spartan king in exile at the Persian court, was that the heir should be the son born in the purple, born after the father was already king, rather than the firstborn. Xerxes grew up in a court whose scale, sophistication, and ceremonial weight had no parallel anywhere in the ancient world. By his mid-20s, he had been appointed governor of Babylon, the empire's wealthiest province, and had managed its administration for over a decade before he ever wore the crown. He was not an untested man thrust unprepared onto a great throne. He was the most prepared heir the Achaemenid dynasty ever produced. He came to the throne in 486 BC at roughly 35 years old, and his first act was to suppress a revolt in Egypt that had broken out in the final years of his father's reign. He handled it quickly and without the elaborate diplomacy of previous Persian engagements with Egypt. The Delta was ravaged, the usurper removed, and a Persian satrap installed with a harder hand than Darius had applied. Egypt was pacified, its special administrative arrangements reduced. Before the dust had settled, news arrived from Babylon. 2 nationalist pretenders had declared themselves king in rapid succession. Xerxes sent his son-in-law Megabyzus to handle the second, who was suppressed with a severity that had not been seen in Babylon since the Assyrians. The city's fortifications were torn down. The statue of Marduk, the theological cornerstone of Babylonian kingship, the same statue that Cyrus had presented himself as honoring when he entered the city, was removed and melted. The era of Cyrus's bargain with Babylon was over. The Babylon decision was the most consequential domestic policy choice of Xerxes' reign, and it has been read in opposite directions ever since. On one reading, it was a catastrophic abandonment of the tolerance that had made the empire governable, the moment when the Persian crown decided that repeated Babylonian revolt had exhausted its patience with the city's special status, and that the administrative costs of maintaining Babylonian exceptionalism outweighed its benefits. On another reading, it was a straightforward response to a province that had revolted twice in a decade and needed to be brought firmly inside the imperial structure rather than continued in its privileged semi-independence. Both readings contain truth. What they agree on is that after Xerxes, Babylon was an ordinary province, its priests no longer the endorsers of Persian royal legitimacy, its ancient ceremonial status dissolved into the same administrative framework that governed every other satrapy. If the Greek campaign of 480 BC was, by the standards of Achaemenid royal ambition, an entirely logical undertaking, Darius had left it unfinished. The burning of Athens by the Persians was, from the Persian side of the exchange, a settling of accounts for the burning of Sardis. A temple of the goddess Cybele had burned there during the Ionian revolt, and the Persian crown had waited almost 20 years to answer it. Xerxes prepared the expedition with a thoroughness that matched the scale of what he intended. Supply depots established years in advance along the Thracian route, 2 boat bridges built across the Hellespont, a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the Cape where a storm had wrecked Mardonius's fleet a decade earlier. The logistical investment alone represented years of coordinated effort across multiple provinces. This was not impulsiveness. It was the most elaborately prepared military operation the empire had ever mounted. After Salamis and Plateau, Xerxes returned to his empire and governed it for another 15 years. Those 15 years are almost entirely absent from the popular telling of his life because the Greek sources, which are the only detailed sources, had no particular interest in what Xerxes did when he was not fighting Greeks. What he did was build. The final years of his reign produced more construction at Persepolis than his father had managed in his entire kingship. The Hall of 100 Columns, a throne room of extraordinary dimensions, its 100 columns each 20 meters high. Its entrance flanked by carved bulls and its door jambs covered in relief sculpture, was begun under Xerxes and completed by his successor. His own residential palace on the terrace, the harem building, and major additions to the royal treasury all date from this period. The Persepolis that survives, with all its fragmentary magnificence, is in very large part the work of Xerxes. His own inscriptions describe a king who understood himself in entirely traditional Achaemenid terms: the chosen of Ahura Mazda, the upholder of truth against the lie, the protector of those who were just, and the punisher of those who were not. The so-called Diva inscription, found near Persepolis, records Xerxes ordering the destruction of shrines dedicated to devas, demonic figures in the Zoroastrian understanding of the cosmos, in territories that had previously worshipped them. It has been read as evidence of religious intolerance, a departure from the Achaemenid tradition of letting subject peoples worship as they chose. It is probably better understood as a statement of royal ideology, the king's duty to extend the realm of truth against the realm of the lie, directed at least in part toward his own Persian audience, rather than a systematic persecution of subject religions. The temples of the empire's major cults continued to function throughout his reign. What genuinely changed under Xerxes was the texture of the court. He was the first Achaemenid king who spent the majority of his reign at Persepolis rather than on campaign, and the court that formed around him in those later years became increasingly enclosed, increasingly factional, and increasingly dangerous. The Hazarapat, the commander of the 1,000, effectively the chief of the royal household guard, became the most powerful intermediary between the king and the world outside the palace. Access to the king was controlled. The networks of loyalty and obligation that had given the early Achaemenid kings their personal authority across the empire began to be filtered through the court hierarchy. This was not unique to Xerxes. It was the structural tendency of every hereditary monarchy that survived long enough to become comfortable. but it accelerated under him. And it created the conditions for what came next. In August 465 BC, Xerxes was murdered in his bedchamber. The account preserved by Ctesias names the Hazarapat Artabanus as the instigator, acting with the help of a court eunuch named Aspamitris. The versions disagree in their details, whether Xerxes' son Darius was killed first or after, whether the next heir Artaxerxes was complicit or deceived. But the outcome is consistent across all of them. Xerxes died at roughly 55 years of age, 21 years into his reign, killed by the men closest to him in the palace he had spent those years building and beautifying. The king who had bridged the Hellespont, who had watched his fleet enter the Straits of Salamis, who had burned Athens and built the Hall of 100 Columns, and died not in battle and not of age, but in the political darkness of his own court, which had grown around him like a world he could no longer see out of. The afterlife of Xerxes in the Western imagination has been determined almost entirely by three sources: Herodotus, who treated him with a complexity that later readers largely discarded; Aeschylus, whose tragedy The Persians, performed in Athens just 8 years after Salamis, depicted him as a hubristic king undone by overreach; and the Book of Esther in the Hebrew Scripture, which presents a king named Ahasuerus, who is almost certainly Xerxes, ruling from Susa over a vast empire, making decisions in wine-soaked court sessions while his officials maneuver around him. Each of these portraits captures something real. Herodotus's Xerxes is genuinely complex. Aeschylus's Xerxes embodies a Greek moral lesson. The Xerxes of Esther is a literary figure in a story with its own purposes. None of them are the man who governed the largest empire in human history for 21 years, held it together through 2 major revolts, completed the most ambitious building program in the ancient world, and was murdered by his own household guard in a palace whose carved reliefs still stand. The Xerxes of the film 300, bejeweled, androgynous, divine, towering, is the logical endpoint of a 2,500-year process of caricature. It begins with Aeschylus needing a dramatic villain, continues through every subsequent European tradition that required a despotic East to define itself against, and arrives at a piece of entertainment whose Xerxes is a fantasy with no connection to the historical record. The historical Xerxes wore Persian court dress, spoke Old Persian and probably Elamite and Babylonian, governed his empire from a throne room he had spent a decade building, and left behind administrative records, the Persepolis tablets, the royal inscriptions, the satrapy accounts, that show a functioning state operating at a level of institutional sophistication that the Greek world would not approach for another century. That king deserves to be known on his own terms. He has not been. The man who came to the throne after Xerxes was murdered in 465 BC was his third son, a young man who took the name Artaxerxes, the Persian Artaxerxes, meaning whose reign is through truth. He killed the conspirators who had killed his father, suppressed a challenge from a brother who had been implicated in the coup, and then settled in to govern for 41 years. His reign is almost invisible in the popular telling of Persian history, sandwiched between the dramatic campaigns of Xerxes and the civil wars that followed his own death. The invisibility is a measure of success. Artaxerxes I managed the empire's most persistent problems: Egypt, Babylonia, the Greek cities, a rebellious satrap, without spectacular victories and without catastrophic failures. And the empire he left behind in 424 BC was more administratively mature than the one he had inherited. That kind of kingship does not generate dramatic narratives. It generates functioning states. His first serious test was Egypt, which revolted in 460 BC behind a Libyan prince named Inaros, who had allied with Athens. An Athenian fleet of 200 ships sailed up the Nile and helped the Egyptian rebel forces hold the delta against the initial Persian response. For 6 years, Egypt was effectively out of Persian hands, the longest sustained loss of a major province in the empire's history to that point. Artaxerxes responded by sending his best general, Megabyzus, with a rebuilt force. And by the time Megabyzus was finished, the Athenian fleet was destroyed and Inaros was captured. The Nile Delta was reclaimed, the province reorganized, and the satrap replaced. Egypt returned to the tribute rolls. It had been expensive, protracted, and unglamorous. Artaxerxes had done it anyway. The strategic lesson of Egypt informed everything that followed. Yet Artaxerxes understood, perhaps more clearly than his predecessors, that direct military confrontation with the Greek world was a net drain. The Athenians had helped Egypt rebel. They had done so because the Delian League, the alliance of Greek city-states that Athens had organized after the Persian Wars, gave Athens the naval capacity and the treasury to project force into the eastern Mediterranean. The Persian response was not to build another fleet for another invasion. It was to fund the enemies of Athens within Greece itself, supporting first Sparta and then Thebes with enough Persian gold to keep the Greek world occupied fighting itself. The strategy worked with a precision that brute force never had. The Peace of Callias, negotiated around 449 BC, formalized the arrangement that both sides had arrived at through exhaustion. The Persians withdrew their fleet from the Aegean. The Greek cities of Ionia retained their autonomy within the Persian system. Athens acknowledged Persian authority over Anatolia. The treaty's exact terms are disputed. Some scholars question whether a formal document ever existed, but the peace it represented was real enough. After Callias, Persia, and Athens were not formally at war again for a generation. Artaxerxes collected his Ionian tribute, watched Athens and Sparta work toward open conflict, and waited. By the time he died in 424 BC, the foundations of the Peloponnesian War, the catastrophic 40-year struggle between Athens and Sparta that would drain Greek power for a generation, were already laid. Persian gold had helped lay them. Artaxerxes also left his mark on the Jewish world in ways that echoed for millennia. Yet the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Scripture record 2 separate commissions issued under his name. One authorizing the priest Ezra to travel from Babylon to Jerusalem to restore the observance of Jewish law, and another permitting the royal cupbearer Nehemiah, a Jew in the Persian court, to return to Jerusalem and oversee the rebuilding of the city's walls. Both of these were consistent with Persian administrative practice. The empire had a long history of commissioning local religious leaders to restore order and proper observance among subject peoples as a mechanism of provincial pacification. Artaxerxes continued that tradition with the same pragmatic logic that Cyrus had established. The Jerusalem that emerged from those commissions, walled, legally governed, its temple functioning, was partly a Persian construction project. Artaxerxes I died in 424 BC, and his queen Damaspia died the same day, possibly of the same illness, possibly of something more deliberate. His intended heir, Xerxes II, lasted 45 days before being murdered by a half-brother named Sogdianus. Sogdianus ruled for 6 months before another half-brother, Ochus, organized sufficient support to have him killed in turn. Ochus took the throne as Darius II and spent most of his reign managing the consequences of the instability that had brought him to power. He put down a Median revolt, managed a Lydian revolt, and navigated the Greek world through the early years of the Peloponnesian War, backing Sparta against Athens after 412 BC in a strategic shift that helped seal Athens' defeat. He died in Babylon in 404 BC, leaving a succession dispute between 2 sons that would bring the empire closer to self-destruction than anything the Greeks had managed. The civil war of 401 BC began almost before Darius II's body was in the ground. His eldest son Artaxerxes had already been crowned as Artaxerxes II when his younger brother Cyrus the Younger, his mother Parysatis' favorite, who had served as satrap of western Anatolia and believed himself the better man for the throne, assembled an army of Persian and allied troops, including 10,000 Greek mercenaries recruited from across the Aegean, and marched east toward Babylon. The two brothers met near the village of Cunaxa, north of the city, in the summer of 401 BC. The Greek mercenaries on Cyrus's right flank routed the Persian forces opposite them completely. On the other side of the battlefield, Cyrus charged personally toward his brother's position and was killed. By a javelin by a bodyguard, the accounts differ, before his victory on the right could be converted into anything decisive. The rebellion died with him. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves stranded in the middle of the Persian Empire, their employer dead, their route home blocked. They elected new officers, Xenophon among them, and marched north through Mesopotamia and up through the highlands of Armenia toward the Black Sea coast, fighting off Persian pursuit and local harassment for months until they reached the coast at Trebizond. Xenophon wrote up the experience in the Anabasis, which became one of the most widely read texts in the ancient world. A practical manual for how a disciplined force could survive inside the Persian Empire even without Persian support. Military commanders across the Greek world read it carefully. Alexander of Macedon almost certainly did too. Artaxerxes II governed for 46 years, the longest reign of any Achaemenid king. The empire he managed was not the confident, expanding structure of Cyrus and Darius. Egypt declared independence in the opening years of his reign and resisted every attempt at reconquest for the next 60 years. The Great Satraps' Revolt between 366 and 362 BC drew several of his western provincial governors into a coordinated rebellion that was suppressed more through the rebels' failure to hold together than through any decisive Persian action. But the empire held. The administrative structures that Darius had built 2 generations earlier proved robust enough to survive a king who was, by most accounts, more interested in building than fighting. Artaxerxes II extended Persepolis substantially, moved the summer capital back to Ecbatana, added gilded columns and silver roof tiles to its audience halls, and erected temples to the goddess Anahita across the empire's major cities. The promotion of Anahita, the Iranian goddess of waters, fertility, and wisdom, alongside Ahura Mazda and Mithra in Artaxerxes' royal inscriptions, was a significant shift in the religious register of Achaemenid kingship. Earlier, kings had invoked Ahura Mazda almost exclusively. Artaxerxes II's inscriptions at Susa explicitly name all 3 deities, and his building of Anahita temples in Ecbatana, Susa, Babylon, and other major cities represented a considerable investment in a goddess whose worship was older than Zoroastrianism and whose popular following cut across the empire's ethnic and cultural boundaries. Whether this was sincere personal devotion, political calculation, or both is impossible to determine. What it produced was a Persian royal religion that looked more pluralist, more accommodating of older Iranian traditions, and more comprehensible to subjects who had never fully embraced the more demanding aspects of Zoroastrian theology. The long afternoon of the Artaxerxes reigns, 41 years of the first, 46 of the second, with the turbulent interlude of Darius II between them, was the period in which the Persian Empire settled into its mature identity. It was no longer growing. It had stopped trying to bring Greece fully to heel. Egypt was a problem it could not solve. But across the broad center of its territory, the administrative machinery was working, the roads were maintained, the tribute was flowing, the provincial economies were functioning, and dozens of peoples were living inside a structure that asked only for taxes, soldiers, and a formal acknowledgement of who was in charge. The kings of this period were not Cyrus. They were not Darius. They were the custodians of something those men had built, and the custodianship, for the most part, was adequate. Empires do not need greatness every generation. They need competence, continuity, and an administrative structure robust enough to survive the reigns when neither genius nor catastrophe is at hand. The Achaemenid dynasty had a structural problem built into its foundations, and it was the same problem that every polygamous monarchy in the ancient world eventually confronted. The king took multiple wives and produced many sons. Each son had a mother with her own interests, her own loyalists, and her own calculation of which child's elevation would serve her best. The king named an heir, usually but not always the eldest, and that designation held only as long as the king was alive, and the other sons had not yet decided that the risk of challenging it was worth taking. There was no formal succession council, no established body of nobles with the recognized authority to adjudicate competing claims. There was the king's word, the armies available to enforce it, and the willingness of the court to accept the outcome. Yet when a king died in his bed after a long reign, the system worked tolerably well. When he died young, or was murdered, or died before naming an heir clearly, the system produced the same result every time, brothers killing brothers until one of them ran out of challengers. The weakness had been present from the beginning. Cambyses had killed Bardia in secret rather than in the open, which meant that the killing could be denied and the denial exploited. Darius had seized the throne through a conspiracy rather than inheritance, which meant that every subsequent pretender could point to the Achaemenid precedent of a non-hereditary accession and call it tradition. The Behistun inscription that Darius carved into the cliff above the road to Ecbatana was, among other things, an argument, the most elaborate royal argument in the ancient world, for why what he had done was legitimate. The need to make that argument at all was the tell. Legitimacy that requires a cliff face of text to establish is legitimacy that has already been questioned. The reign of Artaxerxes II had demonstrated what a long, stable monarchy looked like even amid the structural fragility. 46 years on the throne, Egypt lost and not recovered, the great satrap's revolt absorbed and suppressed, and the court in Susa functioning without catastrophic internal breakdown. His successor, Artaxerxes III, who came to the throne around 358 BC, was a genuinely formidable king, energetic, ruthless, and determined to reverse the territorial losses of the previous two reigns. He reconquered Egypt in 343 BC after a campaign that combined Persian, Greek mercenary, and allied forces in a coordinated operation that the Egyptians, despite 60 years of successful resistance, could not withstand. He suppressed revolts in Phoenicia and Cyprus. He restored the central authority of the crown over satrapies that had grown semi-autonomous during the long, quiet decades of his father's rule. For the first time in a generation, the empire looked like it was recovering its earlier vigor. Then, Bagoas killed him. The man who ended the most effective reign the empire had seen in decades was a court eunuch who had risen through the administrative hierarchy to become, in effect, the empire's most powerful official below the king himself. His title was Chiliarch, commander of 1,000, at the head of the royal household, and the access it gave him was total. In 338 BC, Bagoas poisoned Artaxerxes III. He then poisoned most of Artaxerxes' sons, leaving only the youngest, Arses, whom he installed on the throne as a puppet. Arses reigned as Artaxerxes IV for 2 years, during which Bagoas appears to have run the empire himself. When Arses showed signs of moving against his handler, Bagoas poisoned him too. The Achaemenid royal house, which had been producing capable kings within living memory, had been reduced by one court official to a bloodline of corpses. The world Bagoas had cleared now had only one viable Achaemenid candidate left, a man in his 40s named Kodomanes, or a great-grandson of Darius II, who had served as satrap of Armenia and distinguished himself in single combat during a campaign against a Cadusian rebel years earlier. He had no expectation of the throne, no preparation for it, and no court network to draw on. He was crowned as Darius III in 336 BC, took note of what Bagoas had done to his three predecessors, and when Bagoas predictably attempted to poison him as well, forced the Chiliarch to drink the poison himself. It was the most decisive act of his reign. The man he had removed and the chaos that man had caused had already done the damage. Darius III inherited a throne that 3 successive poisonings had hollowed out. Its prestige intact in the provinces, its internal coherence shattered at the center. The structural problem went deeper than any individual actor, however monstrous. The court that had developed around the later Achaemenid kings was the product of a century of increasing enclosure. The early kings, Cyrus, Darius, even Xerxes in his campaigns, had moved through the empire, led armies in the field, held direct audiences with provincial delegations and local elites, and maintained the kind of personal authority that required constant presence and demonstration. The later kings governed increasingly from within the palace. The Hazarapat, the chief of the royal household, controlled who got in. The queen mother and the royal wives managed the harem, which was not merely a domestic institution, but a political one. The network of women whose sons were potential heirs, whose brothers and fathers were satrap candidates, and whose loyalties were the daily substance of court factional politics. The eunuchs occupied the nodes of this network in ways that gave them power entirely disproportionate to their formal rank. They were the administrators of the harem, the personal attendants of the king, the intermediaries between the inner court and the outer world. Their position made them simultaneously indispensable and invisible, present at every private moment, trusted with every intimate communication, and by definition excluded from the dynastic stakes that made the nobles dangerous. A eunuch could not become king. He could only make kings and unmake them, and in the later Achaemenid period, several of them did exactly that. The system that Darius had designed to check satrapal power, the triple division of administrative, military, and financial authority, had no equivalent mechanism for checking the men inside the palace walls. The satrapies themselves contributed to the erosion in a different but related way. The further from the center, the more a satrap resembled a king. He lived in a palace, held court, maintained his own army, struck his own arrangements with local powers, and in some cases had been in post long enough that the province understood itself as his personal domain. The Great Satraps' Revolt of 366 to 360 BC, in which the governors of Lydia, Ionia, Caria, Phrygia, Cappadocia, and Egypt coordinated briefly in open rebellion against Artaxerxes II, had not succeeded primarily because of Persian military strength. It had collapsed when the satraps, unable to agree on a common program beyond the removal of the current king, turned on each other. The revolt's failure was a product of the same factionalism that made the court dangerous. It revealed something important. The empire could survive a generation of weak kings at the center because its provincial structures were robust enough to function independently. It could not survive indefinitely without someone at the center capable of holding the loyalty of the men who ran those structures. Egypt's 60 years of successful independence between 404 and 343 BC was the most visible symptom of that erosion. The Egyptians had not achieved independence through any military genius. They had held it through Persian inability to mount a coherent campaign against them. 3 separate Persian expeditions failed to retake the province before Artaxerxes III succeeded. One, under Artaxerxes II, was called off after initial reverses, another was abandoned when Greek mercenaries refused to march, and a third was defeated with the help of Greek commanders who knew exactly how to use the delta's canals and marshes as defensive terrain. The empire that had absorbed Egypt in a single season under Cambyses now required 60 years. and 4 attempts to take it back. The change was not in Egypt's strength, it was in Persia's. The news that reached Susa from the west in 334 BC of a Macedonian army crossing the Hellespont under a 22-year-old king was not initially alarming. The Persians had dealt with Greek armies before in every configuration. They had beaten them, bought them, hired them, and outlasted them. Darius III had a functioning empire, intact satrapies, and access to manpower that dwarfed anything Macedonia could field. What he did not have was time. Time to repair the court, to rebuild the central military command, to reconstruct the trust between throne and satrap that Bagoas had spent 5 years destroying. The army that marched to meet Alexander at the Granicus River in 334 BC was real, and it was large. The institution behind it, the decision-making structure at its head, the chain of command between the king at Susa and the commanders in the field, all of it was shakier than it looked from the outside. And Alexander was very good at finding out what things looked like from the outside. Now, Alexander crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC with approximately 40,000 men, a Macedonian and allied Greek army that was, by Persian provincial standards, a medium-sized raiding force. The empire it was crossing into had governed half the world for 2 centuries. Its western satrapies alone could field armies larger than Alexander's entire invasion force. Its treasury at Persepolis held wealth that would take 10,000 mules and 500 camels to carry away. The Persians had seen Greek armies before. They had hired them, beaten them, bought them off, and occasionally been beaten by them. And nothing in their experience of Greek military power suggested that what was coming across the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC was anything more than the most recent in a long series of Western incursions that the empire would absorb, punish, and move past. They were wrong in a way that no one could fully explain, then or now. At the Granicus River in May 334 BC, the satraps of Western Anatolia made their first mistake. They positioned their cavalry on the far bank, a formation designed to cut Alexander down at the crossing rather than to fight in open ground where Macedonian tactics were most dangerous. A Greek mercenary commander named Memnon of Rhodes told them this was wrong, that they should pull back, burn the countryside, deny Alexander supply, and wait. The satraps ignored him. They considered it dishonorable to yield territory without a fight, and they probably believed the river crossing alone would be enough. Alexander attacked at an angle, personally leading the cavalry charge across the water and up the far bank directly into the Persian line. The fighting was brief and brutal. The satraps broke. Memnon retreated. The western coast of Anatolia was open. What followed the Granicus was as important as the battle itself. Alexander moved down the Ionian coast, releasing the Greek cities from Persian-appointed tyrants and proclaiming their freedom. The populations in most of these cities had been restless under Persian rule for decades, and they received the Macedonians with genuine relief in many cases. Persian administrative authority in western Anatolia collapsed quickly, not because Alexander destroyed it, but because the people who had administered it either surrendered or fled before he arrived. The one serious resistance was at Halicarnassus, where Memnon and the remnant of the Persian force held out behind strong walls long enough to evacuate by sea. Halicarnassus burned, but Memnon survived. He took the Persian fleet north and began harassing the Aegean islands, threatening Alexander's supply lines across the water. He died of illness in 333 BC, and the maritime threat died with him. Darius III made his first great error at Issus in November 333 BC. He had assembled a large army in the broad plains of Mesopotamia, ideal terrain for the kind of cavalry-heavy engagement in which Persian forces excelled, and then moved it northwest into the narrow coastal corridor of Cilicia to intercept Alexander, who had marched south toward Syria. The narrow ground between the mountains and the sea canceled the Persian numerical advantage entirely. Alexander's Macedonian phalanx, heavy infantry locked in a wall of overlapping shields and 6-meter sarissa pikes, could not be outflanked in a corridor barely 3 kilometers wide. Alexander himself led his companion cavalry in a charge that broke the Persian left and drove directly toward the center where Darius stood. Darius's chariot was seen turning and leaving the field before the battle's outcome was clear. His army, watching its king flee, broke and ran. He left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his personal treasury. Alexander's treatment of Darius's family was deliberate and calculated. He received them with courtesy, addressed Darius's mother Sisygambis with the respect due a queen, and guaranteed the safety and comfort of the entire household. Plutarch records that Sisygambis initially mistook Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion and a taller man, for the king, and prostrated herself before him. When the error was pointed out, she was mortified. Alexander told her she had not been wrong. Hephaestion was also Alexander. Whether or not the exchange happened exactly as recorded, the policy it illustrated was real and consistent. Alexander wanted the Persian court to understand that its world was not being destroyed, but absorbed. He was positioning himself not as the enemy of Persia, but as its next king, which required the Persian royal family to remain functional and treated with honor rather than degraded. Darius twice offered terms. After Issus, he proposed to cede all Persian territory west of the Euphrates and pay a ransom for his family. Alexander refused. After further reverses, Darius offered everything west of the Euphrates again, plus 10,000 talents and the hand of his daughter. Alexander's general Parmenion reportedly said that he would accept those terms if he were Alexander. Alexander replied that so would he if he were Parmenion. He wanted the empire entire, not a portion of it. The refusals committed him to a course that could only end one way. Either he conquered everything, or the empire eventually marshaled enough strength to destroy him. He appears to have understood this clearly and accepted it without apparent anxiety. Gaugamela in October 331 BC was the decisive engagement, and Darius made the same mistake twice. He chose the battlefield himself, a wide open plain in what is now northern Iraq, where he had the ground leveled to allow his scythed chariots to operate effectively, and positioned his enormous force to envelop the smaller Macedonian army on both flanks simultaneously. Alexander countered by refusing to march straight toward the Persian center, instead leading his cavalry obliquely to the right, drawing the Persian left out of position to follow him. When the Persian line stretched and thinned to match his movement, a gap opened in the center. Now Alexander wheeled his companion cavalry left and drove straight through it toward Darius. For the second time in 2 major engagements, the Persian king saw the Macedonian cavalry coming directly at him and left the field. The army, watching him go, collapsed. Babylon surrendered without a fight. The Persian satrap of the city, Mazaeus, rode out to meet Alexander and offered the keys. Alexander entered the city to the cheers of a population that had been paying heavy tribute to a court it rarely saw and had no particular reason to defend. He sacrificed to Marduk. He reappointed Mazaeus as satrap. He continued eastward. Susa surrendered. Its treasury yielded 50,000 talents of silver. Alexander pressed on toward the Persian heartland, Persis itself, the homeland of the Achaemenids, and at the Persian Gate, a narrow mountain pass northeast of Persepolis, a Persian satrap named Artaxerxes held him for weeks with a small force fighting from prepared positions. Alexander eventually found a path around the flank, trapped the defenders, and broke through. Artaxerxes died fighting. The road to Persepolis was open. Alexander held Persepolis for 4 months before it burned. He emptied the treasury, the accumulated tribute of 2 centuries, the wealth that had built the roads and the palaces and the canal and the fleet, all of it loaded onto the backs of mules and camels and carried west. Then, in May 330 BC, the palace complex burned. Every ancient source that records it connects the fire to a night of heavy drinking and the suggestion of a Greek woman named Thais, an Athenian courtesan who was the companion of Alexander's general Ptolemy. That the burning of Persepolis was the proper revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander is said to have led the procession with a torch. He is also said to have regretted it the next morning. Both things are probably true. What burned with the cedar beams and timber roofs were the Zoroastrian sacred texts written on goatskin parchment, the tapestries, the art, the accumulated cultural production of 2.5 centuries of the greatest empire the world had known. It cannot be recovered. Darius fled east from Gaugamela toward Ecbatana and then further into the Iranian highlands, sending letters to his eastern satraps asking for their loyalty and their armies. The letters came back with ambiguous answers. In June 330 BC, moving through the salt desert east of the Caspian Sea, Darius was overtaken by a group of his own commanders led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who stabbed him and left him in a cart on the road. A Macedonian scout found him still alive, brought him water, and stayed with him while he died. When Alexander arrived, he covered the body with his own cloak and sent it to Persepolis for a royal burial. He then declared himself the avenger of Darius, the legitimate successor whose duty it was to pursue Bessus as a regicide and a traitor. He hunted Bessus across Bactria and Sogdia for 2 years, captured him, mutilated him in the Persian manner for killing a king, and had him executed. The world that Alexander had entered 4 years earlier no longer existed in any institutional sense. The satrapies continued to function. He kept many of the Persian governors in place and appointed his own men alongside them, often in the same triple division structure that Darius had designed. The royal road still ran. The courier system still operated. The provincial economies kept producing the grain and silver and textiles that had always sustained the empire's operations. What was gone was the center, the court, the king, the theological claim to rule in the name of Ahura Mazda, the Achaemenid bloodline that had given the whole structure its legitimacy. Alexander tried to fill that center himself, adopting Persian dress, performing the Persian prostration ceremony, marrying a Bactrian princess named Roxane, and later a daughter of Darius III, promoting Persian nobles into his administration. His Macedonian companions found it intolerable. Several of them he had killed for saying so. He died in Babylon in June 323 BC, at 32 years old, probably of typhoid fever complicated by heavy drinking and the accumulated physical damage of a decade of almost continuous campaigning. He had no designated heir. His wife Roxane was pregnant. When his generals asked him on his deathbed to whom he left the empire, he is reported to have said, "To the strongest." Whether or not he said it, the answer proved accurate. His generals spent the next 40 years fighting each other across the wreckage of 2 empires, slicing the world into pieces that none of them could reassemble. The Achaemenid system, the roads, the administrative structures, the idea of governing diversity through tolerance rather than terror, survived in the Seleucid Empire that emerged from the wars, and in the Ptolemaic Egypt that Ptolemy carved out for himself, and eventually in the Parthian and Sasanian Persian dynasties that recovered the Iranian heartland in the centuries that followed. The empire ended. The idea of it did not. Empires end. The Achaemenid dynasty ended in the summer of 330 BC when Bessus's men left Darius III dying in a cart on a desert road east of the Caspian. But the things an empire builds, the roads, the administrative habits, the legal frameworks, the ideas about how to govern people who are different from each other, these do not end with the dynasty. They get absorbed into whatever comes next, sometimes intact, sometimes transformed, was sometimes so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of the successor world that no one remembers where they came from. The Persian Empire ended. The Persian world did not. Alexander knew this, and it unsettled his Macedonian officers deeply. He wore Persian court dress. He adopted the proskynesis, the Persian prostration ceremony, as a requirement for those entering his presence. He promoted Persian nobles into his administration and his officer corps. He married Roxane of Bactria and Statera, daughter of Darius III, and encouraged his officers to marry Persian women at the mass wedding at Susa in 324 BC. He was not, in his own estimation, destroying Persia. He was becoming its next king. His Macedonian companions considered this a betrayal of everything the war had been fought for. So Alexander considered it the only sensible way to govern what he had conquered. The argument between them was, at its root, the same argument that had animated the entire Achaemenid experiment: whether diversity in an empire was a problem to be overcome or a condition to be worked with. The Seleucid Empire, that carved out the largest portion of Alexander's territory after his death, inherited the Persian administrative structure almost in its entirety. The satrapies continued under new names and often with the same personnel. The royal road kept functioning. Aramaic remained the administrative lingua franca of the eastern provinces for another century. The legal traditions of Babylon, the temple estates of the Mesopotamian cults, and the water management systems of the Iranian Plateau, none of these things required Macedonian reinvention because they already worked. What the Seleucids added was a Greek administrative layer on top of a Persian foundation, and the Persian foundation bore the weight without difficulty. It had been designed to bear weight. Zoroastrianism survived Alexander's conquest and the burning of the Avesta, the sacred texts written on oxhide parchment that were lost with the library at Persepolis, and re-emerged in the Parthian period and reached its fullest institutional development under the Sasanian Empire, which held the Iranian Plateau from 224 to 651 AD. The Sasanians regarded themselves as the restorers of the Achaemenid order. They took that claim seriously enough to carve their own royal reliefs at Nakshi Rostam, directly beside the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, explicitly linking their legitimacy to the kings who had stood there before them. Zoroastrianism, as a state religion, lasted in Persia for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Achaemenids. As a living faith, it continues today, practiced by the Parsi communities of India and by Zoroastrian communities in Iran and across the diaspora. The oldest continuously practiced religion in the world, born from a literate tradition, its fire altars still burning. The theological ideas that move through the Persian world and outward into the surrounding cultures are among the most consequential in human intellectual history. The Jewish community that lived under Achaemenid rule for 2 centuries, in Babylon, in Egypt, in Judah itself, absorbed through daily contact and cultural exchange, is a set of concepts that had no clear parallel in earlier Hebrew thought. A cosmic struggle between forces of good and evil, a day of final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, angels and demons as distinct spiritual beings, a linear rather than cyclical vision of time moving toward a decisive end. These ideas appear in Jewish texts composed during and after the Babylonian exile in forms that closely mirror Zoroastrian theology. They passed from Jewish thought into early Christianity and from both into Islam. The heaven and hell of the modern Abrahamic world, the devil, the apocalypse, the resurrection. These are not purely Semitic concepts. They carry the fingerprints of the Iranian plateau, of a religion shaped in the highland pastures east of the Zagros and carried west into the most fertile cultural soil in human history. The administrative inheritance was equally far-reaching and considerably more direct. The Roman Empire, which inherited the Hellenistic world that Alexander had made, administered its provinces through a system of appointed governors, with separate financial and military officials operating alongside them. A structure that maps onto the Achaemenid triple division with enough precision to suggest transmission rather than coincidence. The Roman cursus publicus, the imperial postal and courier system, followed the same organizational logic as the Persian royal road. Way stations at regular intervals, fresh animals, authorized travelers drawing standardized rations. The Roman practice of allowing subject peoples to maintain their local laws, religions, and customs within a Roman legal framework was the same bargain Cyrus had struck with Babylon in 539 BC. The Romans did not copy Persia. They absorbed the Hellenistic world that had already absorbed Persia, and the structural logic of governing diverse peoples at imperial scale had by then become so embedded in the fabric of how large states worked that it no longer required attribution. The garden was another gift, and it is easy to underestimate. The formal garden that Cyrus laid out at Pasargadae, the walled enclosure with geometric water channels, cypress trees, and flowering plants arranged in ordered patterns, gave the ancient world a new concept that it did not previously have in this form. The Persian word for it was paradisa, a walled enclosure. The Greeks took the word and transliterated it. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, used it as the word for the Garden of Eden. Latin inherited it from Greek. It passed into English through French. The word paradise comes from a Persian garden in the plain of Fars, built by a king who preferred to sit among trees rather than behind walls. The Persian road network shaped the physical geography of the Middle East in ways that persisted for centuries after the Achaemenid state ceased to exist. Roads built to move armies and couriers became the arteries along which trade moved, and trade routes, once established, are extraordinarily persistent. The Great Silk Road trading network that connected China to the Mediterranean from roughly the 2nd century BC onward followed, in its western sections, routes that Darius had maintained and Cyrus had walked. Yet the cities that grew up along those routes, Ecbatana, Rage, Hecatompylos, Merv, Bactra, were already established centers because the Achaemenids had made them nodes in their administrative network. The empire's physical infrastructure outlived every political order that succeeded it until the coming of Islam, and in some cases, well beyond that. What is most difficult to transmit across 2.5 millennia is the human texture of what the empire actually felt like from inside. The daily reality of living in a world where your language, your god, your legal tradition, and your local rulers had been left largely intact by a power that could have destroyed all of them. Most people who lived under the Achaemenids left no record. The farmer in the Nile Delta, the weaver in Babylon, the horse breeder in Media, the merchant moving lapis lazuli along the royal road, they did not write histories. They paid their taxes, raised their children, maintained their temples, and lived out their lives inside the largest and most administratively sophisticated structure the ancient world had produced. That they did so without, for the most part, constant revolt or systematic resistance is itself a kind of evidence. The bargain the empire offered them was not perfect. It was good enough, and that is rarer than it sounds. The reason the Persian Empire remains poorly understood, the reason most people who know Thermopylae do not know the Cyrus cylinder, know Xerxes from a film, but not from his own inscriptions, know the 300 but not the 50 million, is not a failure of scholarship. The scholarship is rich, detailed, and growing. It is a failure of transmission, and the failure has a specific cause. The people who wrote the most eloquent, most widely read, most narratively compelling account of the Persian world were the Greeks, and they wrote about it as the enemy. Herodotus was brilliant and largely honest, but he was telling a Greek story in which Persia was the antagonist. That story was so well told, so thoroughly reproduced across 2,000 years of Western education, that it became the default frame. Every subsequent account has had to fight upstream against it. What the clay tablets, the inscriptions, the Babylonian chronicles, and the archaeology of Persepolis reveal, when you read them alongside Herodotus, rather than in his shadow, is an empire that can stand on its own terms. Not a more heroic empire, and not a more villainous one. A more real one. Complex, contradictory, capable of extraordinary administrative sophistication and periodic brutal suppression, built on a governing philosophy that was genuinely new in human history, and that genuinely worked for the better part of 2 centuries across half the known world. The King of Kings is gone. The garden city of Pasargadae is a set of limestone column bases in a dry Iranian plain. The Apadana staircase at Persepolis still carries its procession of carved delegations toward a throne room with no roof and no king. But the fire the Zoroastrian priests kept burning day and night in the temples of the empire, the fire that Xerxes' inscription promised would always be tended, the fire that Alexander's soldiers could not quite extinguish, that fire is still burning somewhere. It has never entirely gone out.